Hey guys, imagine this. A man who dreamed of painting postcards in Vienna ends up as the architect of the deadliest war in history, all while throwing tantrums over his vegetarian diet and obsessing over his dog's tricks. But what if I told you Hitler's life was a bizarre carnival of quirks, from failed art school rants to midnight ice cream binges amid bombing raids? Buckle up, because we're peeling back the absurd layers of the Führer's strange antics, ones that make you laugh in horror and cringe at the nightmare he unleashed. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture Vienna in 1907, a city buzzing with imperial grandeur. Coffee houses filled with intellectuals debating Freud and Wagner, and a young Adolf Hitler, barely 18, strutting in with dreams bigger than his mustache would ever grow. Ah, the irony. Here's a kid from a sleepy Austrian town, Linz, convinced he's the next Michelangelo, armed with nothing but a sketchbook and a chip on his shoulder the size of the Alps. He applies to the Academy of Fine Arts twice, mind you, and gets rejected both times. The examiners? They basically tell him, "Kid, your humans look like stick figures from a bad dream. Try architecture instead." But Hitler? No backup plan. He sulks, paints mediocre landscapes to sell to tourists, and nurses a grudge that would one day engulf the world. Can you imagine? The man who orchestrated the Holocaust started as a failed artist, hawking postcards like a street vendor peddling knockoff watches. It's absurd, isn't it? The pain of rejection twisting into something monstrous, while the rest of us just eat ice cream and move on. But let's rewind a bit further, to his childhood in Braunau am Inn, 1889. Born to Alois Hitler, a customs officer with a temper hotter than a forge, and Clara, his doting mother, who probably spoiled him rotten. Alois was no picnic, rumored to be the illegitimate son of a Jewish employer, which adds a layer of historical irony so thick you could spread it on toast. Young Adolf clashes with his old man constantly. Alois wants him to follow in the bureaucratic footsteps, but Adolf? He's daydreaming about heroism inspired by those over-the-top German legends. School? A disaster. He flunks out, fakes illnesses to skip classes, and spends his days wandering meadows, reciting poetry to imaginary audiences. Survival back then meant dodging his father's belt and clinging to fantasies of greatness. Oh, the pain of it. A boy lost in a world that didn't care, brewing resentment like a storm cloud over the Danube. By 1908, orphaned and broke, Hitler drifts to Vienna, crashing in homeless shelters and men's hostels. Here's where the antics kick in. He befriends a guy named August Kubizek, a fellow dreamer who later spills the beans in his memoirs. Kubizek describes Hitler as this eccentric whirlwind, pacing their tiny room for hours, ranting about politics, Jews, and how the world owed him fame. He'd burst into operatic areas at midnight, waking the neighbors, or sketch grand opera houses that looked like fever dreams. Money? Scarce. They'd share a loaf of bread, Hitler insisting on his artistic diet of milk and veggies, already foreshadowing his later vegetarian obsession. But irony alert, while preaching purity, he'd sneak honey cakes and cream puffs. Survival meant hustling, painting signs, shoveling snow, anything to avoid real work. In the sarcasm of fate, Vienna's Jewish community, thriving with artists and intellectuals, becomes his scapegoat. He watches them succeed where he fails, and the bitterness festers like an untreated wound. Fast forward to 1913. Hitler flees to Munich to dodge Austrian military service. Cowardly? Maybe, but he calls it destiny. World War I erupts and suddenly he's volunteering for the German army. Here's a twist. The man who hated authority thrives in the trenches. As a dispatch runner, he dodges bullets like a character in a bad war flick, earning the Iron Cross for bravery. But his antics? Legendary. Comrades recall him as the oddball who never smoked, drank, or chased women. Instead, he'd lecture them on German purity while munching apples. He'd adopt a stray dog, Foxel, treating it like royalty amid the mud and mustard gas. Imagine the absurdity, shells exploding, men dying, and Hitler sketching battle scenes or reading Schopenhauer by candlelight. Survival? Pure luck. gassed in 1918, temporarily blinded, he weeps in a hospital, blaming the November criminals for Germany's surrender. That pain, the sting of defeat, fuels his rage, turning a quirky loner into a venomous orator. Post-war Munich, 1919. Chaos reigns. Communists, monarchists, everyone fighting for scraps. Hitler joins the German Workers' Party, a ragtag group of nationalists. His first speech? A rant that lasts hours, mesmerizing the crowd with his wild gestures and piercing stare. The antics amp up. He designs the Nazi flag himself, that swastika slapped on red like a bad tattoo. He'd practice speeches in front of mirrors, perfecting those dramatic pauses and fist pumps that look ridiculous now, but hypnotized thousands then. Irony? He's funded partly by wealthy industrialists terrified of Bolshevism while preaching against capitalism. Survival means adaptability. He survives an assassination attempt in 1923 during the Beer Hall Putsch, that farcical coup where he marches on Munich like a tipsy revolutionary. Ah, the Putsch, pure historical absurdity. November 8, 1923. Hitler bursts into a beer hall, fires a shot into the ceiling, missing everyone, thank goodness, and declares a revolution. The crowd? Half drunk, half confused. He kidnaps officials, promises glory, but it all fizzles like flat beer. Marching the next day, police open fire. Hitler dislocates his shoulder diving for cover, then flees in a car, hiding in a friend's attic dressed in pajamas. Captured, tried for treason, and turns the courtroom into a stage. Sentenced to 5 years, he serves 9 months in Landsberg prison, luxury edition, his cell like a hotel room, visitors galore, dictating Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess. The book? A rambling mess of autobiography and hate, but it sells like hotcakes later. Pain of imprisonment? Minimal. He gains weight, reads voraciously, and emerges a celebrity. Comment below. What's the most absurd failed coup you've heard of? Does this top the list? 1920s. Nazi rise. Hitler's antics go full circus. He surrounds himself with eccentrics. Goering, the morphine-addicted pilot. Himmler, the chicken farmer turned SS boss. Goebbels, the club-footed propagandist with a Napoleon complex. Hitler, the ringmaster. He'd throw fits over trifles, once screamed at his chef for serving meat, insisting on his Führer diet of boiled veggies and herbal teas. Yet he'd devour sweets, fudge, cakes, while lecturing on Aryan health. Irony drips. The man promoting superhumans was a hypochondriac, popping pills for everything from gas to insomnia. Survival in politics meant manipulation. He woos crowds with promises of jobs, then unleashes SA thugs to smash opponents. The sarcasm? He preaches peace while arming for war, all with that Chaplin-esque mustache twitching. By 1933, Chancellor Hitler. How? Economic despair, Weimar weakness, and his hypnotic speeches. Inauguration day, parades, torches, the works. But behind scenes, strange habits emerge. He'd wake at noon, breakfast on coffee and biscuits, then pace his office dictating rants. Afternoons, long drives in his Mercedes, stopping for ice cream cones amid adoring fans. Evenings, movie marathons, Disney cartoons were his fave, Snow White making him tear up. Absurd? Absolutely. While plotting conquest, he's giggling at dwarves. Pain of the era. Ordinary Germans, starving in the Depression, latch onto his promises, unaware of the nightmare brewing. Let's zoom on his personal life, or lack thereof. Eva Braun, his secret girlfriend from 1929, endures his whims. She'd film home movies at the Berghof, his mountain retreat, capturing Hitler in silly poses, playing with dogs, teasing kids, even doing a jig after France falls in 1940. But the irony? He bans marriage for himself, calling it a distraction, yet keeps Eva hidden like a guilty pleasure. Their dates? Walks where he'd monologue about architecture, ignoring her. Survival for Eva? Emotional starvation, suicide attempts, all while the world burns. 1930s policies, the absurd ramps up. Nuremberg laws strip Jews of rights, yet Hitler exempts some honorary Aryans like his childhood doctor. He'd obsess over details, designing uniforms, cars, even the Volkswagen Beetle as the people's car. Irony, meant for families, it becomes a war machine. He'd host tea parties for diplomats, charming them with stories, then plot their downfall. Comment, time. If you could ask Hitler one sarcastic question about his art career, what would it be? Let's keep the engagement going. World War II erupts 1939. Poland invaded and Hitler's antics hit wartime peak. He'd micromanage from his bunkers, moving toy soldiers on maps like a kid with Legos. Sleep schedule? Nocturnal. Up all night, dozing days, driving staff mad. Diet fads continue. Raw veggies, injections of bull semen for vitality. Yes, really. Pain of survival. Soldiers freezing on the Eastern Front, while he warms by firesides, ranting about Slavic inferiority. His health? A comedy of errors. Dr. Morell, his quack physician, pumps him with amphetamines, vitamins, and who knows what. Hitler vibrates with energy, then crashes. Flatulence issues, legendary. He'd clear rooms with his wins, blaming his veggie diet. Absurdity, the Führer, image of strength, popping pills like candy. 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Invading Russia, his biggest blunder. He'd ignore generals insisting on no retreats, dooming armies to Stalingrad's hell. Irony, inspired by Napoleon, he repeats the same mistakes. Survival tales, soldiers eating rats, freezing in -40 degrees, while Hitler feasts on strudel in Berlin. Personal quirks persist, love for animals. He'd ban vivisection, promote vegetarianism, yet experiment on humans. His dog Blondie, pampered royalty, trained to perform tricks. In bunkers, amid air raids, he'd play fetch while bombs fall. Sarcasm of history, caring for pups, gassing millions. As war turns, paranoia spikes. 1944. Valkyrie plot. Bomb in his conference room explodes, but he survives with singed pants and burst eardrums. His reaction? Ecstatic, proof of providence. Executes plotters brutally, watching films of their hangings like Netflix binges. Pain, betrayal, stings, accelerating his decline. Bunker life, 1945, the endgame. Berlin crumbling. Hitler marries Eva in a hasty ceremony, then dictates his will. Final antics, testing cyanide on Blondie, weeping as she dies. Then suicide, pistol and poison, body burn, legacy, a nightmare. But wait, that's jumping ahead. Let's linger on the 1930s cultural absurdities. Hitler fancied himself a culture czar. He'd ban degenerate art, modern stuff like Picasso while hoarding classics. His personal collection, looted treasures. Irony, the failed painter dictating taste, burning books while quoting Nietzsche wrong. Olympics, 1936, Berlin spectacle. Jesse Owens, Black American, wins gold, shattering Aryan myths. Hitler snubs him, but privately fumes. Antics, he'd cheer German victories with awkward salutes, looking like a windmill in a storm. Foreign policy follies, Munich Agreement, 1938. Chamberlain waves peace in our time. Hitler chuckles inwardly. He'd mimic accents in private, mocking allies. Survival diplomacy, bluffing strength while army rebuilds. Comment below. What's the strangest Hitler fact that blows your mind? Share to keep the conversation alive. His architecture obsession dreamed of rebuilding Berlin as Germania, with domes bigger than St. Peter's, models built, plans drawn, all while ignoring economic realities. Absurd, prioritizing monuments over munitions. Vegetarianism myth, not strict. Squab, liver dumplings occasionally, but preached it for health, linking meat to Jewish corruption. Pain, forced on entourage, who snuck sausages. Hypochondria details, feared cancer like his mother. Constant checkups, yet ignored real issues like Parkinson's tremors in later years. Entourage antics, Goebbels' affairs, Goering's jewels. Hitler tolerated as long as loyalty held. Youth indoctrination, Hitler. Youth, brainwashing kids with marches and songs. Irony, he avoided children, finding them noisy. Film buff, loved King Kong. Hated Gone with the Wind for American propaganda. Watched newsreels obsessively. Superstitions, consulted astrologers early on, then banned them. Believed in fate, yet planned meticulously. Voice, that screeching speech style. Practiced but in private, soft-spoken, almost shy. Mustache, copied from Charlie Chaplin. No, but admired his films, trimmed for gas mask fit in World War I. Art theft, amassed 6,000 plus pieces, planned Fuhrer Museum in Linz, never built. Comment, if Hitler applied to art school today, think he'd get in? Why or why not? Early influences, idolized Richard Wagner, attended operas religiously, fantasized composing but couldn't read music. Vienna days deeper, anti-Semitism brewed from pamphlets like Ostara, occult nonsense about Aryans. War experiences, claimed no fear, but comrades said he hid during heavy fire. Post-Putsch. In prison, wrote poetry, bad sentimental stuff. Rise to power, exploited Hindenburg's senility, maneuvering cabinet. Chancellery life, long monologues bored guests to tears. Survival tip, nod and agree. Night of Long Knives, 1934. Purged essay leaders, including Rome, his old pal. Antics, arrested in pajamas. Kristallnacht, 1938. Orchestrated pogrom, then denied involvement. Irony, fined Jews for damages. Appeasement era, dance jig on film after France surrender, edited out later. Barbarossa, prep, ignored warnings about Russian winter citing willpower. Stalingrad, refused surrender, dooming 91,000 POWs. Assassination attempts, 42 known, all failed, providence or luck. Bunker routines, tea with secretaries, discussing dogs while allies close in. Final days, birthday. April 20th, 1945. Somber affair, gifts ignored. Suicide, April 30th with Eva, bodies doused in gasoline. Legacy, absurdity of a nobody becoming monster. But this is just the start. Stay tuned for part 2, where we dive deeper into wartime whims. Picture Berlin, January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler, the failed postcard painter, is now Chancellor of Germany, strutting into power like a peacock with a bad haircut. The irony is thicker than his beloved Bavarian cream cakes. A man who couldn't hold a job in Vienna now holds a nation in his fist. His first act? Not policy, not reform, but a tantrum over the Chancellery's decor. He demands new curtains, grander furniture, because apparently world domination starts with velvet drapes. Meanwhile, Germany's unemployed starve, and the Weimar Republic's corpse is still warm. Survival for ordinary folks means scraping by on breadlines, while Hitler's already planning torchlit parades to stroke his ego. Comment below. If you could redesign Hitler's office with one sarcastic touch, what would it be? A clown statue? A mirror that only shows his mustache? Let's talk his daily routine, because it's a masterclass in absurdity. Hitler wakes at noon, groggy from late-night rants, sipping coffee while aides tiptoe around his mood swings. Breakfast? A sad plate of biscuits and herbal tea, because the Fuhrer is still clinging to his vegetarian shtick. Though, don't be fooled, he's sneaking chocolate truffles when no one's looking. Afternoons are spent pacing, dictating speeches that sound like a thesaurus exploded, or sketching grandiose buildings for his dream city, Germania. Evenings? Movie time. He's obsessed with Hollywood flicks. King Kong is a favorite, maybe because he sees himself in the big ape, misunderstood and smashing everything. The pain of it all. While he's giggling at cartoons, his propaganda machine churns, and Jews lose their rights under the Nuremberg laws of 1935. It's a sick juxtaposition, Disney dwarves and dehumanization. His relationship with Eva Braun? A soap opera of neglect. Eva, a bubbly photographer's assistant, lives in a gilded cage at the Berghof, his alpine retreat. She films home movies of Hitler goofing off, tossing balls for his dog Blondie, teasing kids, or practicing that awkward salute like a kid mimicking a superhero. But romance? Barely. He'd rather lecture her on Wagner than hold her hand. Eva's survival strategy, endless patience, and secret diaries, where she vents about his coldness. In 1935, she tries suicide. Pills, a cry for attention. Hitler sends flowers and moves on. The irony, he bans marriage for himself, claiming it distracts from his mission, yet keeps Eva hidden like a mistress in a bad novel. Comment, What's the most absurd thing you'd put up with in a relationship? Let's hear it. Now, let's zoom out to the political circus. Hitler's Nazi party is a freak show of misfits. Goering, the flamboyant pilot, struts in medals and furs, addicted to morphine and looting art. Himmler, the ex-chicken farmer, dreams of Aryan nights while running the SS like a cult. Goebbels, the pint-sized propagandist, spins lies so slick they shine. Hitler plays them like a maestro, pitting them against each other to keep control. His leadership style? Part tantrum, part theater. He'd scream for hours over a misspelled memo, then charm diplomats with fake humility. Survival in his inner circle meant dodging his wrath and kissing the ring, or at least the swastika. The 1936 Berlin Olympics. Oh, what a spectacle. Hitler sees it as his global debut, a chance to flex Aryan supremacy. He builds a colossal stadium, flags everywhere, and grins like a kid at a fair. Then Jesse Owens, black American sprinter, steals the show, winning 4 golds. Hitler's face? Sour as sauerkraut. He snubs Owens, muttering about American tricks, but privately he's livid, his racial myths crumbling on live display. The absurdity: he bans jazz as degenerate, but taps his foot to it in private. Survival for athletes like Owens? Running faster than hate itself. Drop a comment. What's your favorite underdog story from history? Does Owens top it? Foreign policy? A masterclass in bluffing. By 1936, he remilitarizes the Rhineland, breaking the Versailles Treaty. France and Britain? They shrug. Hitler's gamble pays off, and his confidence soars. In 1938, he annexes Austria, his homeland, marching in like a conquering hero. Viennese crowds cheer, forgetting his art school flops. The Munich Agreement follows, where Chamberlain hands over Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland for peace. Hitler mocks the British PM behind closed doors, mimicking his umbrella twirling like a vaudeville act. The pain: small nations swallowed, millions betrayed, while Hitler's antics, those wild gestures, that screeching voice, hypnotize the masses. Let's talk his health, because it's a tragic comedy. Dr. Theodore Morell, his personal quack, is less doctor, more mad scientist. He pumps Hitler with a cocktail of amphetamines, barbiturates, and sketchy vitamins that'd make a pharmacist faint. Result? Hitler's a jittery mess, bouncing between manic energy and zombie-like crashes. His flatulence: oh, it's legendary. Aides dread closed rooms, blaming his veggie diet, though Morell's pills don't help. Irony: the man preaching Aryan perfection is a walking pharmacy, trembling with early Parkinson's by 1939. Survival for his staff? Holding their breath, literally and figuratively. World War II kicks off, September 1st, 1939. Poland's crushed in weeks thanks to Blitzkrieg, Hitler's lightning war fetish. He's giddy, sketching victory arches while tanks roll. But his micromanaging? Disastrous. He'd pore over maps, moving pins like a kid playing Risk, ignoring generals who begged for strategy. In 1940, France falls, and here's a gem. Hitler does a jig, caught on film, though Nazi editors later cut it. Imagine the Führer, dancing like a drunk uncle at a wedding, while Paris burns. The pain: millions displaced, cities razed, all for his ego trip. His obsession with Britain? Weirdly personal. He admires the British Empire, calling it Aryan kin, yet bombs London to rubble in the Blitz. He'd stay up nights listening to air raid reports, munching pastries while civilians died. Irony: he offers peace deals, expecting Churchill to fold, but gets a metaphorical middle finger instead. Survival for Londoners? Hiding in tube stations, praying through sirens. Then comes 1941, the mother of all blunders, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler's convinced he'll crush Stalin in months, inspired by his hero Napoleon, who, spoiler alert, also failed spectacularly in Russia. He ignores warnings about winter, supply lines, everything. Willpower, he screams, as if shouting could thaw frozen tanks. By December, German troops are stuck in minus 40 degrees Celsius, eating shoe leather, while Hitler rants in his warm wolf's lair bunker, blaming everyone but himself. The absurdity: he bans retreats, dooming entire divisions. Comment: What's the dumbest decision you've ever seen a leader make? Does this top it? His personal life gets weirder. Eva Braun throws parties at the Berghof, trying to play First Lady, but Hitler's too busy with war games. She knits, skis, and films him obsessively, capturing moments like Hitler napping on a lawn chair, Blondie chewing his boots. He dotes on that dog. Blondie's fed better than most Germans, with tricks like saluting by paw. The pain. Eva's trapped in a loveless limbo while genocide escalates. By 1941, the Holocaust is in full swing. Einsatzgruppen murder squads, death camps rising. Hitler's detached, signing orders between cake slices. Cultural antics? He's still playing art czar. He loots Europe's museums, amassing thousands of paintings for his never-built Führer Museum in Linz. Modern art? Burned or sold. He calls it Jewish filth, yet keeps some for himself. Irony. The failed artist becomes history's biggest art thief. Survival for curators? Hiding masterpieces in cellars, praying Nazis don't knock. His speeches, oh boy. By 1942, they're less fiery, more unhinged. He'd ramble for hours, sweating through his uniform, promising victory while Stalingrad crumbles. Aides sneak naps during these marathons. The sarcasm. He'd praise German resilience while cities starved. Comment. Ever sat through a boring speech? How'd you survive? Health update. Morel's concoctions wreck him. He's gaunt, trembling, yet insists on superhuman diets. Raw carrots, fennel tea. His teeth rot. Dentists are terrified to fix them. Pain. His body's failing, mirroring his empire. Daily life in the wolf's lair. A bunker sitcom. He'd hold court with secretaries, joking about old Vienna days, then snap into rages over typos. Meals? Elaborate, with silverware looted from France. He'd lecture on history while sauce dribbled on his tie. Survival for staff, nodding through his monologues, avoiding eye contact. The Eastern Front grinds on. Stalingrad, 1942-43, is hell frozen over. German soldiers, frostbitten and starving, surrender en masse. 91,000 POWs, most never return. Hitler blames Paulus, the general, calling him a coward. The absurdity. He promotes Paulus to field marshal, expecting suicide over surrender. Didn't happen. His animal obsession persists. He bans fox hunting, citing cruelty while death camps churn. Blondie's puppies are gifted to allies, propaganda stunts. Irony. He weeps for animals, not humans. Diplomacy? A clown show. He meets Mussolini, mocking Il Duce's theatrics privately, yet apes his style. Japan's alliance? He admires their honor, but calls them yellow behind closed doors. Survival for allies, stroking his ego while dodging his plans. Comment. What's the weirdest pet name you've heard? Does Blondie beat it? By 1943, the tide turns. Allies bomb Germany. Hitler hides in bunkers, emerging paler each day. He dreams of wonder weapons, V-2 rockets, jet planes, too late to matter. His optimism, delusional. He tells Goebbels victory's near, even as Berlin's rubble grows. Superstitions creep in. He consults old astrology charts despite banning them. Dreams of Viking ancestors guide him, or so he claims. The pain. His grip on reality slips, dragging millions with him. This sets the stage for part 3, where paranoia and defeat tighten their grip. Stay tuned and comment. What's the most absurd thing you learned about Hitler today? Keep the convo going. The year is 1943, and Adolf Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich is looking more like a 1,000-day headache. Stalingrad's a fresh wound. Hundreds of thousands dead, surrendered, or frozen into oblivion. And the Allies are tightening the noose. Bombers pound Berlin, Soviet tanks grind west, and yet Hitler's holed up in his wolf's lair bunker, acting like he's still the star of this grim show. Picture him, hunched over maps, moving pins with trembling hands, muttering about willpower, as if it could stop a T-34 tank. The irony? He's preaching invincibility while his empire crumbles and his personal quirks, those absurd, almost cartoonish habits, are in overdrive. Survival for Germans means dodging bombs and hunger. For Hitler, it's dodging reality. Comment below. What's the most delusional thing you've ever seen someone believe? Does Hitler's denial beat it? His daily life's a surreal routine. He wakes at noon, eyes sunken from sleepless nights, thanks to Dr. Morell's chemical cocktails, amphetamines to rev him up, barbiturates to knock him out. Breakfast? A pathetic spread of stale bread, jam, and fennel tea, because the Führer's still obsessed with his vegetarian pose. But don't be fooled. Aides catch him sneaking marzipan bars stashed like contraband in his desk. He'd lecture on Aryan purity while crumbs fall from his mustache. The pain. German cities starve. Ration cards barely buy a potato, yet Hitler's fussing over dessert. His staff? They tiptoe around his moods, knowing one wrong word could mean a screaming fit or worse. Survival tip: keep your head down and your flattery ready. Let's talk bunkers, because they're his stage now. The Wolf's Lair, hidden in East Prussian forests, is a concrete maze of paranoia. He paces its damp corridors, ranting about betrayal, while air raid sirens wail in the distance. Meetings drag on, Hitler monologues for hours, voice cracking about Napoleon or Viking sagas, while generals stifle yawns. His table manners? Atrocious. He'd slurp soup, dribble sauce, then wipe his hands on his pants, all while planning invasions. The absurdity: he demands spotless uniforms from his officers but can't keep his tie clean. Comment: ever worked for a boss with gross habits? Spill the tea, what's the worst? Eva Braun, poor Eva, is still in the picture, playing house at the Berghof when Hitler visits. She's like a ghost in his life, knitting sweaters, filming home movies, and throwing parties he barely attends. Her latest hobby? Teaching Blondie, his German shepherd, new tricks, rolling over, playing dead, which feels like grim foreshadowing. Hitler dotes on that dog more than Eva, feeding it table scraps while she pines for attention. In 1943, she's desperate, staging photo ops to feel relevant. Eva in a dirndl, Hitler awkwardly posing like a grumpy uncle at a picnic. The pain. She's trapped, a mistress to a monster, surviving on scraps of affection while the Holocaust's machinery grinds on. Drop a comment. What's the saddest love story you've heard? Does Ava's top it? The war's going south, literally and figuratively. In North Africa, Rommel's Desert Fox act flops as the Allies crush the Afrika Korps. In the east, the Soviets push back, reclaiming blood-soaked ground. Hitler's response? Double down. He sacks generals left and right, blaming them for his own blunders. Operation Citadel, the 1943 Battle of Kursk, is his last big gamble. A massive tank clash he thinks will turn the tide. Spoiler, it doesn't. The Soviets outsmart him, and Germany loses thousands of tanks. Hitler in his bunker throws a fit, smashing a model Panzer like a kid breaking a toy. The irony: he fancies himself a military genius, yet his strategies are cribbed from old history books he misread. Survival for soldiers? Praying for a miracle in the mud. His health's a wreck, and it's a dark comedy. Dr. Morell's now dosing him with everything from glucose injections to something called orchicrin, a quack remedy made from bull testicles. Yes, really. Hitler's jittery, sweating through his uniform, his left hand trembling from what's likely early Parkinson's. His famous flatulence? Worse than ever, meetings are a gas chamber in the literal sense. Aides quietly cracking windows. He's obsessed with his health, demanding daily checkups, yet ignores the obvious. He's falling apart. The sarcasm, the superhuman Führer, poster boy for Aryan strength, can barely hold a pen. Comment: what's the weirdest health fad you've ever heard of? Does bull juice take the cake? Paranoia's his new best friend. By mid-1943, he's convinced everyone's plotting against him. Generals, aides, even his beloved Blondie might be a spy. Okay, maybe not the dog. He installs hidden microphones in meeting rooms, eavesdropping on his own staff. The July 20th, 1944, a Valkyrie plot, where Colonel Stauffenberg plants a bomb in a briefcase, nearly proves him right. The explosion rocks the Wolf's Lair, kills 4, but Hitler survives with singed trousers and a bruised ego. His reaction? Maniacal laughter, claiming Providence saved him. He orders the plotters executed, watching grainy films of their hangings like it's a private screening. The pain. Dissenters die horribly, while Hitler's delusion grows. Survival for his inner circle. Betray nothing, trust no one. Cultural antics keep the absurdity flowing. He's still looting art, shipping masterpieces to secret bunkers, dreaming of his Führer museum. He bans degenerate music, jazz, swing, but secretly hums Benny Goodman tunes when alone. The Berlin Philharmonic plays Wagner on loop for his birthday, April the 20th, 1943, but he's too busy sulking over losses to enjoy it. Irony. The man who burned books and banned art fancies himself a cultural savior, while Europe's heritage vanishes under his watch. His speeches? They're losing their magic. Once, he could whip crowds into a frenzy. Now, he's hoarse, rambling, promising secret weapons like V-2 rockets that arrive too late to matter. Radio broadcasts hide his trembling hands, but listeners hear the strain. Goebbels, his propaganda wizard, works overtime, doctoring photos to make him look vigorous. The sarcasm, Hitler's selling victory to a nation eating sawdust bread. Comment, ever heard a politician oversell a bad situation? How does Hitler's spin compare? Daily life in Germany's a nightmare. Rationing bites harder, coffee's now acorns, butter's a memory. Allied bombs turn cities to rubble. Berliners sleep in shelters, kids clutching dolls amid the din. Hitler? He's cozy in his bunker, sipping chamomile, sketching Germania's domes. The pain, civilians bear the war's weight, while he plays architect. Survival means scavenging, bartering, praying the next raid misses your street. His animal obsession deepens. He passes laws protecting wolves, bans circuses for cruelty, yet signs off on human experiments in camps. Blondie's still his darling, trained to bark at specific cues. He'd spend hours with her, ignoring war reports. The irony, he weeps over a caged bear, but green lights gas chambers. Comment, what's the most hypocritical thing you've seen someone do? Does this take the prize? Foreign relations? A clown show? Mussolini's floundering, Italy's switching sides by late 1943. Hitler rescues Il Duce from a mountain prison, but it's a hollow stunt. Mussolini's a puppet now, propped up by German bayonets. Japan's fighting its own losing war, and Hitler's promises of aid are empty. He mocks his allies in private, doing terrible accents yet expects their loyalty. Survival for diplomats? Smiling through his rants while planning escape routes. Superstitions flare up. He's back to glancing at old astrology charts despite banning them as Jewish nonsense. He talks of fate guiding him, yet obsesses over details. Uniform buttons, tank designs. The absurdity, a man who trusts stars over generals, yet demands precision in everything else. His inner circle's fraying. Göring's drug habit worsens, hoarding looted jewels like a magpie. Himmler's dabbling in occult rituals, dreaming of SS castles. Goebbels churns out propaganda, but even he's losing faith. Hitler pits them against each other, thriving on chaos. Survival tip, stay useful or you're out. By 1944, the end's near. D-Day lands allies in Normandy. The Soviets smash through the east. Hitler's maps are a fantasy, pins marking armies that don't exist. He dreams of a final stand inspired by old Germanic myths. The pain, young boys and old men drafted, sent to die in a lost cause. Comment, what's the most absurd wartime story you've heard? Does Hitler's bunker life top it? Let's keep the convo alive. This sets the stage for the final act, part 4, where the bunker becomes a tomb and the antics end in flames. Stay tuned. It's late 1944. And Adolf Hitler's world is shrinking to the size of a concrete bunker beneath Berlin's ruins. The Allies are closing in, Soviets from the east, Americans and British from the west, and Germany's a smoldering wreck. Cities are rubble, civilians scavenge for scraps, and yet Hitler, the failed artist turned failed dictator, is still playing emperor in his underground lair. Picture him, gaunt, trembling, his once fiery eyes now glassy from Morel's chemical soup of amphetamines and God knows what. He's still barking orders, moving imaginary armies on maps, convinced a miracle will save his Reich. The irony? He's directing a play with no audience, no stage, and a script written in delusion. Survival for Germans means dodging bombs and conscription. For Hitler, it's clinging to a fantasy while the world burns. Comment below, what's the most desperate thing you've seen someone do to avoid reality? Does Hitler's bunker act top it? Life in the Führer bunker is a claustrophobic circus. He wakes at 2 p.m., later every day, his body clock as broken as his war machine. Breakfast? A sad cup of chamomile tea and a biscuit, because his vegetarian obsession persists, though aides smuggle him chocolate when he's not looking. His hands shake. Parkinson's is undeniable now, and his voice, once a weapon, is a hoarse croak. Yet he still rants for hours, blaming everyone but himself. Jews, generals, even the weather. The absurdity. He's screaming about victory while Berlin's skyline is smoke. His staff? They're zombies, surviving on fear and coffee, nodding through his tirades to avoid his wrath. Drop a comment. Ever been stuck in a meeting that felt like a fever dream? How does this compare? Eva Braun's still here, the forgotten fiancée in this grim drama. She moves to the bunker in early 1945, trading alpine picnics for concrete walls. Her antics? Throwing makeshift parties, putting on lipstick like it's 1939, playing records of forbidden jazz to cheer the mood. Hitler barely notices, too busy petting Blondie, his German shepherd, who's the real VIP down here. Eva's home movies stop. There's no sunlight for filming, just flickering bulbs. She writes letters she'll never send, dreaming of a normal life. The pain. She's tied to a man who loves his dog more, surviving on crumbs of hope while the Holocaust's final atrocities unfold above. Comment. What's the most heartbreaking loyalty you've seen? Is Eva's devotion sadder? The war's endgame is brutal. By January 1945, the Soviets are 200 miles from Berlin, and Allied bombs rain daily. Hitler's wonder weapons, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, are too little, too late, like a kid's science project against a tsunami. He pins hopes on splitting the Allies, dreaming Roosevelt and Stalin will feud. Spoiler, they don't. His generals beg for surrender. He screams, "Traitor," and sacks them. The irony. He calls them cowards while hiding underground, safe from the hell he unleashed. Survival for soldiers? Boys as young as 12, drafted into the Volkssturm militia, sent to die with rusty rifles. Comment. What's the most futile fight you've heard of? Does this beat it? His health's a horror show. Dr. Morel, the quack who should have stuck to selling snake oil, pumps him with 28 different pills a day, amphetamines, sedatives, even strychnine in tiny doses. Hitler's a walking pharmacy, his teeth rotting, his stomach a gas factory. Aides hold their breath during briefings, not just from fear. He's obsessed with his ailments, demanding tests for diseases he doesn't have, ignoring the tremors shaking his left arm. The sarcasm. The Aryan god is a jittery wreck, preaching strength while collapsing. Survival for morale? Keeping Hitler high enough to function, low enough not to suspect the drugs are killing him. Paranoia's at fever pitch. After the July 1944 Valkyrie bomb plot failed, Hitler trusts no one. He's got SS guards watching SS guards, microphones in every corner. He suspects poison in his tea, spies in his soup. Even Blondie's food is tested. Poor dog's a canine king, but even she's under scrutiny. The absurdity. He's more afraid of his own people than the Red Army. Survival for AIDS? Never look suspicious, even when tying your shoe. Cultural quirks persist, twisted by war's end. He still dreams of his Führer Museum, now a pipe dream as looted art hides in salt mines. He bans degenerate music, but aides catch him humming a banned Cole Porter tune. Hypocrisy in a bunker. Classic Hitler. His birthday, April 20th, 1945, is a grim affair. A cake nobody eats, gifts he ignores, and a speech promising victory to a room of skeptics. The pain. Children above ground sing his praises in Hitler youth anthems, unaware they'll soon be cannon fodder. Blondie, the dog, is his last obsession. He trains her to fetch pens, bark at maps, even salute with a paw. She sleeps by his cot, eats better than most Berliners. But here's the dark twist. On April 29th, 1945, he tests cyanide on her to ensure it works. Blondie dies in seconds. Hitler weeps inconsolable while ordering mass executions without a blink. The irony, he mourns a dog, but not the millions gassed. Comment. What's the most bizarre pet story you've heard? Does Blondie's fate top it? The final days are pure chaos. April the 28th, 1945. Hitler hears Himmler's negotiating surrender behind his back. He explodes, orders Himmler's arrest, but it's too late. Nobody's listening. On April 29th, he marries Ava Brown in a midnight ceremony, a grim afterthought after 16 years. She wears a black dress. He's in his usual drab uniform. They share champagne and cake, a pathetic toast as bombs shake the ceiling. The pain, a wedding in a tomb, love warped by madness, survival for Eva, accepting her fate as Mrs. Hitler for 36 hours. April 30th, 1945, the end. Berlin's encircled, Soviet shells pounding. Hitler dictates a will, blaming Jews for everything, promising a glorious future. Around 3 p.m., he and Eva retreat to his study. She takes cyanide. He shoots himself, or maybe takes poison too. Accounts differ. Aides find them slumped, blood and venom pooling. They're doused in gasoline, burned in the Chancellery Garden as shells fall. The absurdity. The man who dreamed of eternal glory ends as ash in a crater. Survival? Nobody in the bunker's thinking that far. Most follow him, swallowing capsules or bullets. The aftermath is a grim epilogue. Berlin falls May 2nd, Germany surrenders May 7th. The Reich's gone, leaving 50 million dead, cities flattened, and survivors picking through ruins. Hitler's antics, his rants, his diets, his dog tricks, seem trivial against the Holocaust's horror, the camp's liberation revealing unimaginable evil. Yet those quirks drove the nightmare, a nobody's ego inflating to monstrous scale. The sarcasm, a man who couldn't paint a decent landscape painted history in blood. His legacy is a warning, not a spectacle. The looted art? Scattered, some never found. The Führer Museum? A blueprint in a dead man's mind. Germania? Rubble. Eva's diaries, Blondie's collar, his scribbled sketches, all relics of a fever dream. The pain survivors rebuild, haunted by memories of sirens, starvation, loss. Comment. What's the most chilling historical figure you've studied? Does Hitler's mix of absurdity and evil stand out? Keep the convo going. This wraps our journey through Hitler's strange antics, a tale of a man whose quirks were as deadly as his hate. Thanks for sticking with me. Let's reflect on the madness and never forget its cost. Have you ever been so afraid of a cockroach that you'd rather face a Swedish cannonball? No? Well, then you're already braver than the 6'8" giant who single-handedly dragged Russia, kicking and screaming into the 18th century. Today, we're not talking about Peter the Great, the visionary, the reformer, the shipwright czar. We're talking about Peter, the man who would rather burn down a palace than sleep in a room with high ceilings. Get ready for a story of imperial power, brutal modernization, and a crippling, soul-crushing fear of, well, pretty much everything small and crawly. This is the story of a man who could stare down the Ottoman Empire but would run screaming from a beetle. Welcome to the bizarre and frankly hilarious superstitions of Peter the Great. Intro music with a dramatic yet slightly comical Russian flair. Now, before we dive into the deep end of Peter's neuroses, let me ask you a question, and I want you to be honest in the comments below. What's your biggest, most irrational fear? Spiders? Heights? Public speaking? Whatever it is, I guarantee you it's got nothing on the man who built St. Petersburg. Because while you might be afraid of something that could, actually harm you, Peter the Great was terrified of things that were, for the most part, completely harmless. And when you're an autocratic ruler with absolute power, your personal phobias have a funny way of becoming everyone else's problem. Let's set the scene. It's the late 17th century, and Russia is, to put it mildly, a bit of a backwater. While the rest of Europe is having its fancy pants enlightenment, Russia is still clinging to its medieval traditions like a drowning man to a particularly scratchy woolen blanket. The calendar is different, the alphabet is different, the beards are a whole other story we'll get to later. Into this world of borscht and boyars is born a boy named Pyotr Alexeyevich, a boy who would grow up to be a literal giant, a whirlwind of energy, and a man with a laundry list of phobias that would make a modern-day psychiatrist's head spin. First up on our tour of Peter's peculiar terrors, insects. Now, a dislike of creepy crawlies is hardly unusual, but Peter's entomophobia, specifically his katsaridophobia, that's the fear of cockroaches, for those of you not fluent in Freudian Greek, was the stuff of legend. We're not talking about a simple gross reaction here. We're talking about a full-blown, table-flipping, burn-it-all-down panic. There are numerous accounts from his contemporaries of Peter encountering a cockroach and reacting as if he'd just seen the ghost of Ivan the Terrible. He would leap from his chair, his face pale with sweat, and demand that the offending creature be dispatched with extreme prejudice. And if you were the unfortunate soul in charge of the building where the cockroach was found, well, let's just say you'd be having a very, very bad day. Imagine this. You're a humble servant in the Kremlin. You've spent all day polishing the floors, making sure everything is just so for the Tsar's visit. Peter storms in, all 6'8" of him, fresh from a day of pulling teeth. Yes, he did that for fun, and designing battleships. He's in a good mood, for once. He claps you on the back, a gesture that probably feels like being hit by a small carriage, and then he sees it, a tiny, insignificant cockroach, scuttling across the floor. The Tsar's face, a moment ago so full of boisterous energy, contorts into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He lets out a shriek that could curdle milk and points a trembling finger at the insect. "Kill it," he roars, "and you, my friend, are now on the front lines of a war you never signed up for." But it wasn't just cockroaches. Peter had a deep-seated aversion to all things small and scurrying. Spiders, beetles, even ants, they were all tiny monsters in his eyes. He would meticulously inspect his food, not for poison, but for any sign of an insect infestation. He would have his bedchambers swept and scrubbed multiple times a day. And woe betide the courtier who dared to wear a piece of jewelry that even vaguely resembled a bug. There's an apocryphal story, probably untrue, but too good not to share, that he once banished a foreign dignitary for wearing a scarab beetle pin. The man, a diplomat from some sun-drenched southern land, was simply trying to be fashionable. Little did he know that his choice of accessory would get him a one-way ticket to Siberia. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the guy didn't like bugs. Big deal. But here's where it gets interesting. Peter's phobias were so intense that they actually started to shape his policies. He became obsessed with cleanliness and order, not just in his personal life, but in his empire as a whole. His famous urban planning projects, like the aforementioned St. Petersburg, were designed with wide open streets and canals. On the surface, this was all about creating a modern European-style capital. But one can't help but wonder if, deep down, Peter was also trying to build a city with as few dark, cockroach-friendly corners as possible. A city where the bugs couldn't hide. And this obsession with cleanliness extended to his people. Peter's infamous beard tax, for example, is often seen as a purely symbolic move, a way to force the Russian nobility to adopt a more Western appearance. But think about it. What are beards, especially the long, flowing beards favored by the boyars of old, if not perfect hiding places for, well, you know? Is it really so far-fetched to think that, as Peter was signing the decree that would force thousands of men to shave off their facial hair, a small part of him was thinking, that'll show those little six-legged bastards. But Peter's anxieties didn't stop at the insect world. Oh no, that would be too simple. Our giant Tsar was also afflicted with a profound fear of open spaces and high ceilings. This might seem counterintuitive for a man of his stature, but it's true. He found large, empty rooms deeply unsettling. He would often have false ceilings installed in his palaces to make the rooms feel smaller and more enclosed. He preferred to sleep in small, cramped alcoves, almost like a child hiding in a closet. There are stories of him refusing to enter grand halls and cathedrals, instead conducting his business in small, out-of-the-way chambers. Imagine the sheer absurdity of it all. Here is a man who is literally reshaping a continent, a man who is waging wars, building fleets, and dragging his country into a new era, and he's doing it all while cowering in what amounts to a series of glorified closets. He's a lion in a shoebox, a titan in a thimble, and the irony is, he's the one commissioning the construction of these grand, opulent palaces with their soaring ceilings and vast, echoing halls. He's building his own nightmares. There's a famous story about his visit to the magnificent palace of his close advisor, Alexander Menshikov. Menshikov, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful figures in Russia, had built himself a palace that was the very definition of opulence. It was all gilded ceilings, sprawling ballrooms, and enough empty space to make a minimalist weep with joy. Peter took one look at the place and practically had a panic attack. He refused to go inside until Menshikov had a tent erected in the middle of the grand ballroom, a small enclosed space where the Tsar could feel safe and secure. So there you have it, the ruler of all the Russias sitting in a tent in the middle of a palace, probably checking his boots for cockroaches. What do you think was the root of these fears? Was it some childhood trauma? A bad experience with a particularly aggressive beetle? Or was it something deeper, a reflection of the chaotic and often terrifying world in which he lived? Let me know your theories in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to see what you guys come up with, because the more you learn about Peter the Great, the more you realize that he was a man at war, not just with Sweden and the Ottoman Empire, but with his own mind. He was a man who could conquer armies but couldn't conquer his own anxieties, and that, my friends, is a story far more fascinating than any military victory. In the next part, we'll delve even deeper into the rabbit hole of Peter's psyche, exploring his bizarre medical obsessions, his morbid fascination with anatomy, and the strange, often brutal ways in which his personal fears manifested themselves in the lives of his subjects. Trust me, you won't want to miss it, so hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and prepare yourselves for another dose of historical absurdity. Because when it comes to Peter the Great, the truth is always stranger and funnier than fiction. Welcome back, you connoisseurs of historical madness. In our last episode, we established that Peter the Great, the architect of modern Russia, was a man who could build an empire, but would reportedly have a full-blown meltdown at the sight of a cockroach. We talked about his crippling fear of insects and his bizarre aversion to high ceilings, forcing him to live like a giant in a dollhouse. We left off with a promise to explore an even stranger contradiction. How could a man so terrified of the small, skittering things of this world be so utterly, morbidly fascinated with the gruesome inner workings of the human body? If you thought the bug thing was weird, buckle up. We're about to trade our fly swatters for bone saws, because today we're talking about Peter the Great, amateur surgeon, tooth-pulling tyrant, and Russia's first and only Goth Tsar. So, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the set of terrifying-looking dental tools in the Tsar's pocket. Peter the Great had a passion, a hobby, something to while away the hours between, waging war on Sweden and reforming the national currency. Peter loved to pull teeth, and I don't mean he enjoyed a good, metaphorical, tough negotiation. I mean, he literally, physically enjoyed yanking teeth out of people's heads. He carried a bag of dental instruments with him wherever he went, and he was always on the lookout for a willing, or, more often, unwilling, patient. Imagine the scene at court. You're a boyar, you've got a bit of a toothache, and you make the fatal mistake of letting a wince cross your face in the Tsar's presence. Suddenly, the most powerful man in the country, a man who towers over you like a redwood tree, is striding towards you. His eyes are gleaming with a terrifying, gleeful light. He's not asking about your military readiness or your tax payments. He's asking with far too much enthusiasm, does that tooth bother you? Before you can answer, he's got a pair of rusty-looking pliers in his hand and is telling you to open wide. There was no anesthetic. There was no sterilized equipment. There was just you, your aching tooth, and a 7-foot-tall emperor who saw your mouth as his personal playground. He even kept a collection of the teeth he pulled, a gruesome little bag of trophies from his dental conquests. Historians have examined this collection, and many of the teeth were perfectly healthy. Now, a sane person might call this sadism, a penchant for casual torture. And, well, they wouldn't be entirely wrong. Peter was not a gentleman, but his fascination went beyond a simple love of inflicting pain. It was part of a larger, all-consuming curiosity about the human machine. He wasn't just interested in pulling teeth, he was interested in how the whole thing worked. And to understand that, he knew he had to look under the hood. This obsession would truly blossom during his famous Grand Embassy, his 18-month tour of Western Europe. While his primary goal was to learn about shipbuilding and secure alliances against the Ottoman Empire, Peter spent a significant amount of his time indulging his more anatomical interests. The real turning point came in Holland, the 17th century capital of medical science. It was here that Peter encountered the work of one of the greatest anatomists of the age, Frederick Ruysch. Ruysch was a master of preservation. He had developed a secret embalming technique that allowed him to preserve human organs and even entire bodies with a shockingly lifelike quality. He didn't just pickle things in jars, he turned them into art. He would create elaborate dioramas, or still lifes, using human and animal remains. Imagine tiny skeletons of fetuses arranged to look like they were weeping into handkerchiefs, made of preserved human artery. Imagine a severed child's arm, its veins and arteries injected with red wax, holding a tiny, delicate mayfly. This was Rush's world, a beautiful, macabre, and profoundly unsettling fusion of science and art. And Peter the Great absolutely loved it. He was captivated, while other members of his entourage were horrified, turning green and rushing for the nearest exit. Peter was like a kid in a candy store, a very, very strange candy store. He spent hours in Rush's collection, examining every specimen with a focused intensity. There is a famous, and likely true, story that Peter was so taken with the beautifully preserved body of a child that he leaned over and kissed it on the lips, a gesture that perfectly encapsulates his bizarre relationship with the dead. He didn't see horror, he saw wonder, he saw knowledge. He immediately began taking anatomy lessons from Rush, learning how to dissect bodies, trace the paths of nerves and blood vessels, and prepare specimens for preservation. The man who fled from cockroaches was now, with his own hands, plunging into the viscera of human corpses. What does this tell us? It tells us that Peter's fears were not about gore or death. He was fine with those. In fact, he was drawn to them. His phobia was about a lack of control. A cockroach appears randomly, it skitters and hides, it operates on its own alien logic. It cannot be understood or dominated. A dead body on a dissection table, however, is the epitome of control. It is a machine that has stopped working, a puzzle that can be taken apart piece by piece until all of its secrets are laid bare. In the anatomy theater, Peter was no longer a victim of his anxieties. He was the master of them. He could literally grasp the mysteries of life and death in his hands. Naturally, Peter decided he had to have this collection. All of it. He paid Rush the astronomical sum of 30,000 guilders, a fortune at the time, for his entire life's work. He had thousands of jars containing everything from the preserved brains to the entire vascular system of a man, all carefully packed and shipped back to his new capital, St. Petersburg. But he wasn't building a private collection for his own morbid amusement. Oh no. Peter had a much grander and much more terrifying plan. He was going to share his passion with the Russian people, whether they liked it or not. This collection became the foundation of Russia's first ever museum, the Kunstkamera. Now, when you hear the word museum, you probably think of dusty paintings and boring pottery. That was not the Kunstkamera. The Kunstkamera was a monument to the bizarre, a temple of the abnormal. Peter's goal was to educate the Russian people, to dispel their superstitious beliefs about monsters and demons. His method was to put the monsters on public display. He issued a decree across the entire empire. Any child born with a deformity, a condition we would now understand through genetics, was to be preserved in alcohol and sent to St. Petersburg to be added to the collection. Can you even begin to imagine the horror of that? A grieving mother and father, having just lost their child, are then visited by a government official who demands they hand over the body so it can be put in a jar and gawked at by strangers. This wasn't education, it was state-sanctioned grave robbing, a policy born from one man's obsessive curiosity. The collection grew to include 2-headed lambs, a human skeleton of a man who was, ironically, even taller than Peter, and jar after jar of fetuses with cyclopia, extra limbs, and other congenital abnormalities. It was a carnival of nightmares. And, surprise, surprise, the Russian people were not exactly lining up to see it. They were terrified. They believed the collection was unholy, a gathering of demonic spirits. They crossed themselves and hurried past the building, whispering prayers. Did this deter Peter? Of course not. If the people would not come to the knowledge willingly, he would bribe them. He issued another decree. Every visitor to the Kunstkamera would receive a free shot of vodka, or a cup of coffee, your choice. So now you have this surreal image of 18th century Russians stealing their nerves with a shot of cheap booze before shuffling past the pickled remains of deformed infants, all because their czar had a weird hobby he picked up in Amsterdam. Let me know in the comments, would you take the free vodka to see the 2-headed sheep? Be honest, this was Peter's Russia in a nutshell, a place where progress was often indistinguishable from trauma, where enlightenment was delivered at the point of a sword, or in this case, a pair of forceps in a jar of preserving fluid. Peter's personal journey from being terrified of a bug to being fascinated by a bisected human heart is the story of his reign. It was a desperate, often brutal attempt to rationalize the world, to dissect it, to label it, and to bring it under his absolute control. He wanted to banish the shadows, both in the dark corners of his palaces and in the minds of his people. But in doing so, he created a whole new set of horrors. But Peter's quest for control didn't stop with the dead. He was just as intent on controlling the living. And his methods for doing so were even more strange, more chaotic, and frankly, more debauched than anything we've discussed so far. If you think his idea of science was bizarre, wait until you hear about his idea of a party. Next time, we're leaving the museum and heading to the tavern to explore the drunken, blasphemous, and utterly insane world of Peter the Great's mock court, the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. It's a tale of forced alcoholism, dwarf weddings, and a parody of the church so scandalous it's a miracle the whole country didn't burst into flames. You're not going to want to miss it. Alright, you brave souls, welcome back to the funhouse of horrors that was Peter the Great's psyche. So far, we've learned that the 6'8" father of modern Russia was terrified of cockroaches and high ceilings, but was strangely comforted by dissecting human corpses and pulling teeth for fun. We've seen him build a European capital from a swamp and found Russia's first museum, which he populated with pickled deformities and then bribed people with vodka to attend. If you're just joining us, I suggest you go back and watch the first 2 parts, because you've missed a wild ride. But as strange as all that was, it was merely the opening act. Today, we're pushing past the surgical theater and into the Tsar's inner sanctum, his personal social club, his method for testing loyalty and destroying his enemies. Prepare yourselves for the single most deranged, blasphemous, and lethally alcoholic fraternity in human history, the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters. If Peter's science was a strange mix of genuine curiosity and morbid obsession, his idea of a good time was a 3-day bender that ended in a minor political purge. The all-drunken synod was not just a party club, it was a sophisticated instrument of political terror disguised as a frat house. It was a loyalty test where the final exam involved chugging 1.5 liters of vodka and not accidentally confessing to treason. It was, in short, a team-building exercise designed by Satan himself after a particularly rough night. Let's break down what this thing actually was. On the surface, it was a parody of the Russian Orthodox Church. Peter, who saw the church's traditionalism and power as a major roadblock to his reforms, decided the best way to undermine it was to mock it relentlessly. The synod had its own prince-pope, its own college of cardinals, its own bizarre rituals and vestments, but instead of holy water, they used wine and beer. Instead of incense, they used burning tobacco, which Peter forced his non-smoking courtiers to inhale until they were sick. Instead of solemn prayer, there were compulsory drinking, obscene songs, and violent, humiliating games. Membership was not optional. If you were a high-ranking noble, a powerful general, or a foreign ambassador Peter wanted to size up, you were in the club, and the first and only commandment of the synod was, "Thou shalt get wasted." Refusal to drink was not just a party foul, it was considered a direct act of insubordination against the Tsar himself, and Peter had a special punishment for those who dared to refuse his hospitality. He would bring out the Great Eagle Cup. This was no ordinary cup. It was a massive goblet, holding about 1.5 liters, that's more than a magnum bottle of wine, and it would be filled to the brim with raw vodka. The offender would be held down and forced to drain the entire thing in one go. This wasn't just hazing, it was potentially lethal. Several people are believed to have died from this particular brand of imperial persuasion. The head of this blasphemous cult, the Prince Pope, was Peter's childhood tutor, Nikita Zotov. This wasn't an honor. Zotov was a famously weak-willed and gentle old man, which made him the perfect puppet. Peter delighted in humiliating him. During mock conclaves to elect the new Prince Pope, Peter would lock Zotov and the other cardinals in a room for days on end with nothing but mountains of food and oceans of alcohol, refusing to let them out until they had completed their farcical election. The new Pope would then be consecrated by being doused in cheap beer and paraded through the streets on a sleigh pulled by pigs or bears, while the other members followed, dressed in obscene parodies of religious vestments and shouting, blasphemies. Why? Why would a man obsessed with order, progress, and building a modern, rational state preside over this chaotic, drunken nightmare? For the same reason he dissected corpses. Control. The synod was the ultimate tool for breaking the pride of the old, arrogant boyar nobility. You might be a prince whose family has ruled your province for 500 years, but when the Tsar has forced you to dress as a drunken goat, crawl on all fours, and kiss Nikita Zotov's backside, some of that ancestral arrogance tends to evaporate. It was a great equalizer. In the synod, everyone was brought down to the same level of debased, drunken humiliation. It was also an information-gathering machine. A drunk man's tongue is a loose one. Peter would watch, often drinking less than his guests, observing who complained, who revealed secrets, who couldn't handle the pressure. The synod was a social event, a political purge, and an intelligence agency all rolled into one, soaked in vodka and marinated in fear. But the synod wasn't just about men in power. Peter's love of the bizarre and his cruel sense of humor extended to the most vulnerable members of his court. He had a particular fascination with dwarves, or as they were called then, court jesters of small stature. He collected them from all over the empire, keeping dozens in his household, and for the synod, he devised the most elaborate and cruel spectacle of all, a dwarf wedding. In 1710, Peter decided to marry his favorite court dwarf, Yakov Turgenev, to a dwarf woman from the retinue of the empress. This was not to be a small, private affair. This was a state-sponsored event, a showcase for the all-drunken synod. Peter ordered dozens of dwarves, both male and female, to be brought to St. Petersburg from all corners of Russia. He had miniature carriages built for them, miniature formal clothes sewn, and a miniature wedding feast prepared. A massive procession was held through the streets of the new capital. The bride and groom rode in a crystal carriage, followed by a parade of over 70 other dwarves, all marching in pairs, forced to participate in this humiliating spectacle for the amusement of the Tsar and his drunken cronies. The wedding feast was held in the grand palace of Alexander Menshikov, the same man whose high ceilings had terrified Peter. The dwarves were seated at small tables with small cutlery, served tiny portions of food, all while the full-sized, roaringly drunk members of the synod and the court looked on, laughing. They were forced to drink, to dance, and to perform for their tormentors. It was the culmination of Peter's worldview, a world where everything and everyone, no matter how small or how grand, could be manipulated and controlled for his purposes, whether that purpose was building a navy or staging a grotesque human puppet show. The story has a grim ending. The groom, Yakov Turgenev, already in frail health, was forced to drink so much alcohol at his own wedding feast that he fell ill and died just a few days later. A joke had turned into a tragedy. A life was sacrificed for a laugh. This is the central, terrifying paradox of Peter the Great. He was a visionary who saw Russia's future, but he was also a tyrant who reveled in the debasement of his fellow human beings. He was a man of science who wanted to dispel superstition, but he created his own dark cult ruled by alcohol and fear. He was a man building a rational state by day and presiding over an irrational, blasphemous circus by night. He was, in essence, Russia's own doctor. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the all-drunken synod was his laboratory. So let me ask you, what's the most toxic work environment you've ever been in? I'm willing to bet it didn't involve mandatory bear-drawn sleigh rides and punishment by vodka fire hose. Tell me your workplace horror stories in the comments below. We have now journeyed through Peter's fears, his obsessions, and his cruel pleasures. We have seen him at war with cockroaches and with the church. We've seen him build and we've seen him destroy. But how does the story of this walking, breathing, 7-foot-tall contradiction end? What happens when a man who spent his entire life trying to control everything, from the flow of rivers to the thoughts of his nobles, finally confronts something he cannot dominate, dissect, or drink into submission, his own death? In our final part, we will explore the last years of Peter the Great, his final act of questionable heroism, and the chaotic legacy he left behind. The end of the story is just as strange and just as tragic as the beginning. You won't want to miss the conclusion. Welcome back to the final chaotic chapter in our saga of the strangest man to ever rule Russia. We've journeyed through his crippling phobias of bugs and big rooms. We've witnessed his ghoulish fascination with pulling teeth and pickling human bodies. We've survived a night at his all-drunken synod, a fraternity of forced alcoholism and blasphemous humiliation. We have stared into the abyss, and the abyss, it turns out, is a 6'8" Tsar, who is both a visionary genius and a raging paranoid psychopath. But every story, even one as bizarre as this, must have an end. Today, we witness the final act. What happens when the ultimate control freak, a man who bent an entire empire to his will, confronts the one thing he cannot torture into submission, bribe with vodka, or dissect on a table? This is the story of how Peter the Great faced his own mortality. And in true Petrine fashion, it's a mess of contradiction, irony, and brutal, tragic absurdity. To understand Peter's end, you have to understand his greatest obsession, the one that dwarfed even his fear of cockroaches, his legacy. Who would come after him? Who could possibly carry the torch of his brutal, relentless modernization? This question haunted him. Traditionally, the Russian throne passed to the eldest son. Simple. But for Peter, this was a terrifying prospect. His eldest son, the Tsarevich Alexei, was everything Peter was not. He was quiet, deeply religious, and he openly admired the old pre-Petrine ways of Russia. He liked beards. He liked the church. He had no interest in shipbuilding, warfare, or amateur dentistry. To Peter, Alexei wasn't just a disappointing son. He was a walking, breathing symbol of the backwardness he had spent his entire life fighting. He was the ghost of old Russia, haunting the hallways of his new Europeanized palaces. The relationship between father and son was less of a family drama and more of a slow-motion train wreck. Peter alternately ignored Alexei, threatened him, and tried to force him into his own mold. He ordered him to lead armies, to oversee administrative tasks, to show some spark of the Petrine spirit. Alexei, for his part, tried his best to fail. He would deliberately bungle his assignments, plead illness, or simply disappear, hoping his terrifying father would forget he existed. It was a clash of titans, one of power and one of passivity. Peter, the irresistible force, met Alexei, the profoundly immovable object. The breaking point came when Peter gave his son an ultimatum. Either reform yourself completely and become a worthy heir, or renounce the throne and become a monk. Alexei chose a third option. He ran. In 1716, he fled Russia and sought protection from his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. For Peter, this was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was an act of treason. His own son had defected to a foreign power, making a public mockery of his authority. The control freak lost control. Peter dispatched his most ruthless agents to hunt Alexei down. They found him, and through a campaign of promises and threats, they convinced him to return to Russia. Peter swore on the Holy Scriptures that if Alexei came home and confessed everything, he would not be harmed. It was, of course, a lie. As soon as Alexei was back on Russian soil, the promises of pardon evaporated. Peter stripped him of his right to the throne and began a full-scale investigation into his conspiracy. And by investigation, I mean a brutal, paranoid witch hunt. Peter was convinced Alexei had been plotting to overthrow him, to reverse all of his reforms, to drag Russia back into the Dark Ages. He had to know who else was involved, and so the Tsar who feared cockroaches personally oversaw the torture of his own son. Alexei was interrogated in the dungeons of the Peter and Paul fortress, the very citadel he had built to defend his new capital. He was flogged with the knout, a heavy leather whip designed to strip flesh from bone. Peter was present for these sessions, watching, questioning, demanding names, demanding a confession that would fit the narrative in his own mind. He wanted to break his son, to force him to submit, to exert that final, absolute control. In June of 1728, after weeks of this horror, the broken and dying Alexei was sentenced to death for treason. He never made it to the executioner's block. 2 days after the sentence was passed, the Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich died in his cell, the official cause of death being apoplexy or a stroke. The truth, almost certainly, is that he died from the wounds inflicted upon him during his father's interrogations. Peter the Great, the man obsessed with securing Russia's future, had murdered his own son and heir. He had won his battle for control, but had destroyed his own bloodline in the process. With Alexei gone, the succession was a gaping wound. In 1722, Peter issued a radical new decree, a testament to his own staggering ego. He declared that the reigning Tsar would henceforth have the power to choose his own successor. Anyone could be chosen. It no longer had to be a son or even a relative. It was the ultimate act of a control freak, trying to micromanage the empire even from beyond the grave. But who would he choose? The question hung over Russia like a shroud. Now we come to the end, the final, perfect, ironic legend of Peter's death. In the autumn of 1724, Peter, whose own health was already failing from severe bladder and urinary tract problems, was inspecting some ironworks on the shore of the Gulf of Finland. The weather was brutal, cold and wet. As his boat sailed, he saw another vessel, a boat carrying soldiers, that had run aground in the shallows. The waves were battering it, and the men were being thrown into the freezing water in danger of drowning. Without a moment's hesitation, Peter, the man who had casually sent tens of thousands to their deaths in wars and on construction projects, the man who had tortured his own son, jumped out of his boat. He waded waist deep into the lethally cold, churning water to help rescue the drowning soldiers. The act was pure, unthinking instinct. For a moment, he wasn't the czar, the tyrant, or the reformer. He was just a man trying to save other men. But the heroism came at a terrible cost. The drenching in the freezing Gulf water caused a severe aggravation of his already existing ailments. His condition worsened dramatically. He developed a severe fever, and his urinary blockage became a full-blown crisis, leading to gangrene and unimaginable pain. Was this one heroic act what killed him? Or was he already a dead man walking, his body ravaged by a lifetime of excess and disease? We will never know for sure, but the story itself is the perfect epitaph. A life of calculated cruelty, possibly ended by a single impulsive act of kindness. By January of 1725, he was confined to his bed, dying in agony. The whole court, the whole empire held its breath. Who would he name? He had given himself the ultimate power, and now he had to use it. He was barely conscious, but he managed to ask for a pen and paper. With a trembling hand, he scrawled 2 words, Ostavte vsu, leave all to, and then his strength failed him. He collapsed. He tried to call for his daughter Anna, but by the time she arrived, he could no longer speak. The pen fell from his hand. Peter the Great, the ultimate micromanager, the man who redesigned a nation and gave himself the power to redesign the line of succession, died without naming a successor. His obsession with control had led to the ultimate loss of control. He left behind a power vacuum that would lead to decades of instability, a series of weak rulers, palace coups, and a period dominated by the very guards regiments he had created. He left behind his second wife, a former Lithuanian peasant girl named Catherine, who would become Russia's first reigning empress. He left behind his collection of pickled freaks, his half-built capital city, and a nation that was terrified of him, proud of him, and utterly profoundly changed by him. So, who was Peter the Great? Was he the visionary hero who single-handedly created the Russian Empire? Or was he a cruel, sadistic monster who built his legacy on a mountain of bones? Was he a forward-thinking man of science, or a superstitious man-child who ran screaming from cockroaches? The truth is, he was all of those things. He was a force of nature, a human contradiction, a storm in the shape of a man. His story is not a simple morality tale. It's a chaotic, brutal, and sometimes hilariously absurd reminder that the people who make history are often far stranger and more broken than the statues we build of them. So, what's your final verdict on Peter? Let me know in the comments. Was he a necessary evil? A visionary tyrant? Let's discuss. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of Russian madness. Subscribe for more tales that prove that history is the best horror story ever written. Imagine Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, in his pajamas, a half-smoked cigar wedged like a stubborn island in an ashtray, a rolling sea of papers, cables, and an imperious telephone within reach. And the war, a machine of thunder and telegrams, waiting politely outside the bedroom curtain while he negotiates peace and disaster from the safety of his mattress. If that image shocks you, good, it should. Because the leader who kept the nation standing sometimes did it by working from bed half the day, and that fact is the perfect, absurdly human key to how history limped and laughed through its darkest hours. You think of power as posture, the stern jaw, the polished desk, the standing silhouette against flags in a permanent portrait. But history, particularly British history, has a softer, sleepier limb. It is possible to command empires while horizontal. It is possible to sign declarations, dictate orders, receive codes, console generals, and broil a nation's morale, all while your ankles are propped on an extra pillow. This is not just eccentricity, it's survival strategy, theatrical defiance, and a cunning exploitation of human biology with a side of stubborn aristocratic laziness. This is a life where the bed is not a place for sleep, but a throne, a bunker, and an office with very empathetic sheets. Hook. For the next minute, imagine the most important phone call of the century landing on a bedstand. He answers in a dressing gown. He's not making a statement. He's making history from a horizontal position. Now ask yourself, what kind of man turns the national emergency into a bedroom routine? And why did it work? Stay till the end and tell me in the comments which famous leader you trust to run the world while under a duvet. There are 3 obvious reasons we pretend leaders must stand at attention: symbolism, stamina, and spectacle. Churchill did not dismiss any of them lightly. He understood that the public image of a resolute leader must be shouted from balconies and projected on newsreel. He also understood that the machinery of modern war is uninterested in ideal body posture. It wants decisions, endurance, and oddly enough, naps. For Churchill, bed was a place to manage all 3, dramatic, restorative, and ruthlessly practical. First, the spectacle. Churchill's bed was a stage. When he was filmed in bed, the impression was not of sloth but of singular focus. There's a powerful theater to the man who can make the world wait while he adjusts his pillowcase. Think of it, camera lights low, cigar smoke curling like exclamation marks, a ministerial robe that reads like armor. He turned domesticity into myth. Instead of parading an illusion of perpetual vigor, he offered a new, more intimate kind of authority. One that said, I know fear, I also know how to sleep. Then the stamina. British summers are short, but history's demands are long. Churchill worked famed 18-hour days that looped like an Ouroboros into nights of restless thought. To survive, to remain creative and decisive under strain, he relied on polyphasic sleep, a formal name for naps between meetings, a wink to the human brain's desperate need for restoration. Working from bed let him fragment his day with micro-recovers, a half-hour nap that reset the mind's radar, a cup of tea held like a talisman, a cigarette to signal a new cognitive block. Do not romanticize. This was a biohack born of exhaustion and genius combined, and then the survival instinct. Behind every dramatic anecdote of Churchill's quips and tackles, there's a frail human being with chronic pain, gout in his joints like tiny angry gods, digestive wars, and the heavy, smothering anxiety that any leader knew in wartime. He'd suffered from illness before, and later in life the body tenders reminders in the form of creaks, pings, and the occasional moral collapse. Working from bed allowed him to continue when walking to a desk would be impossible. It was a necessary adaptation, forged on the fly during an era when most men of power had a reputation for stoic endurance, and yet secretly needed a heated blanket and a sympathetic pillow. Let's not be sentimental. Churchill's bed office was also brutally effective. Imagine a morning when intelligence arrived, codes, maps, the hush of imminent bombing across the sea. Instead of schlepping to a circular table, descending stairs, walking the gauntlet of the cabinet, he would have a stenographer poised like a knight, an assistant with a bowler hat full of messages, and a telephone that bridged continents. Dictation was the era's real-time collaboration tool. The Prime Minister could speak, pause to consult a volume of history or a biscuit tin, and resume with decisions that bent supply lines and remolded alliances. It was intimacy and command in the same breath. There is a delicious absurdity in the image. Diplomats in frock coats standing at attention, while ink-stained memos are rolled across a bedspread. Men in uniform, metals clinking like wind chimes, were sometimes presented with orders that originated in a place that should, by all polite conventions, be private. This inversion of the expected is not mere comedy. It's a psychological tactic. When you, as an advisor or foreign envoy, find your leader in pajamas, you relinquish a little of your own authority in deference to the spectacle. You feel small, domestic, oddly tender. That gives the person in bed the upper hand. He is not humble. He is in control of the narrative. He can be casual and crushing all at once. It's a theater trick that maps perfectly onto political dominance. But working from bed also offered Churchill a kind of cognitive advantage that modern bosses might misinterpret. In the morning, he would often sleep late, or at least appear to, then ease into the day with a long, indulgent breakfast. During that time, ideas fermented. Human minds, when allowed to rest, make odd connections. You want associative leaps? Nap and return. The mind, freed from the linear tyranny of schedules, reassembles pieces from different drawers of memory. For Churchill, this was not mystical nonsense. It was an empirical pattern. His most trenchant metaphors, his uncanny knack for timing public phrases that would lift morale, were likely brewed during those horizontal hours. He returned to the telephone with sentences that felt inevitable, as if he had simply remembered what the country needed to hear all along. Now, don't think this was peaceful lazing. The bed was a war room with linens. Telegrams arrived like small detonations in the quiet. Churchill's bed space was wired, both literally and socially. Secretaries perched like hawks, top brass trudged in, and the shadows of bomber squadrons loomed on maps plastered to the wallpaper. This proximity to sleep and to crisis produced a particular kind of leadership, responsive, improvisational, and theatrically human. It made the man appear as a conduit between private frailty and public fury. Let me tell you a small anecdote that may or may not be entirely apocryphal, but truth in a story is sometimes less about the literalities than the cocktail it fashions in your head. One morning, a courier arrived with the latest casualty figures. The ministerial footman performed the ritual of the silver tray, the number stuck to the paper like a coin. Churchill read it, folded the message like a prayer, reached for his cigar, then paused and said almost conversationally, "Arrange a meeting with the chiefs. Also, order more tea." The juxtaposition, numbers that read like obituaries, followed immediately by orders for refreshments, is grotesque and human. It is the practical defense mechanism of someone who refuses to be entirely devoured by grief. He responded not by erasing his appetite for life, but by anchoring it to it. It's barbaric and humane at once. There is also the secretarial choreography to consider. If you work from a desk, you can fling papers, pace in decision-making tantrums, or slam doors. From bed, your range of motion is reduced, which imposes discipline on otherwise explosive personalities. Dictation from a horizontal position requires precision of language. You cannot wave your arms and drown the room in theatricality. The words must land tight and trimmed, and that may have contributed to the famously punchy phrases he produced. Being horizontal breeds concision, because even great men cannot flail when there's a cup of tea to balance. But for every cunning argument, there is a counterpoint. Some of his contemporaries, particularly the more puritanical mandarins, were scandalized and resentful of the bed office. They interpreted the practice as indulgent, proof of a decline. In private letters, critics joked about the bedroom cabinet as if governance had become a farce. It's worth noting that appearances matter in democracies. A leader who seems too cozy risks losing moral authority. Churchill, ever the performer of his own legend, mitigated this by mastering public ritual. His radio broadcasts, his dramatic suits, his staged cigar-lit appearances. He could afford private eccentricity because he balanced it with public spectacle. You could be horizontal at home, but vertical on camera. Another aspect of the bed strategy is biopolitics, the deliberate exploitation of your own vulnerabilities to make others more pliable. When you couch your leadership in the language of sickness, a man who works despite pain, who must negotiate from bed, you trigger empathy. Parliamentarians, diplomats, even the public, can be disarmed by a leader who presents himself as wounded but unbowed. It reframes authority not as a cruel machine, but as a sacrifice. That's powerful persuasion. Churchill leveraged it without shame, broadcasting both competence and fragility like alternating currents that always return the same charge. Respect. And then there are the absurd microeconomies of the bed office. The ashtray becomes an altar, the biscuit tin, a treasure chest, the telephone, an oracle. Secretaries invent new shorthand, typing with the speed of men afraid that a nap will interrupt the message and consign history to slumber. It becomes an ecosystem of small rituals, the way the curtains must be drawn, the precise temperature at which the tea is tolerable, the angle at which pillows must be stacked to avoid a slip into it. When you are running the state from under covers, the small things become critical. The trivialities protect the important ones like coral does a reef. Yet working from bed also introduced a dangerous cognitive bias, decision by comfort. When you are physically comfortable, you may be less inclined to perceive risk. It is easier to tell yourself that the enemy's arrival is manageable when your ankle is warm and your robe is snug. The moral is not that Churchill was reckless. It is simply that every adaptation contains trade-offs. He could move the nuts and bolts of war from a horizontal vantage, but could not escape the fact that sometimes enterprise demands the uncomfortable posture of standing in cold rooms and staring at maps. He compensated with a ferocious appetite for information, delegating movement to those with stronger legs and keeping his own mind nimble. Here's where the story becomes theatrically grotesque. Imagine the stunned silence when a general, breathless from a long train ride, enters to find the Prime Minister in bed, discussing an amphibious landing with the same tone he uses to discuss the weather. Would the general, used to the salon of soldierly posture, clamor to regain his footing? Perhaps. Would he leave with the conviction that this man, horizontal or not, had the mettle to command the sea? Equally likely, the psychology of belief is elastic. If your leader can turn an abnormality into a norm, the abnormality becomes a source of power. At the heart of this is not laziness, but strategy. Churchill's horizontal hours were an optimization of limited energy. Instead of presenting a myth of uninterrupted vigor, he constructed a myth of durable presence. I will be where I must be, even if that place has duvet folds. He refused to let pain, exhaustion, or the petty tyranny of daylight dictate his capacity for decision-making. Instead, he asserted agency over his body's rhythms and made them part of governance. The bed also functioned as a private school in rhetoric and resolve. When alone with his thoughts, surrounded by books and old letters, Churchill wrote the speeches that would buoy a nation. The act of reclining encouraged reflection. A mind stretched over a mattress sometimes thinks in bolder lines. He cultivated a voice that could be snarky, tender, and combative, qualities that fed the morale engine. A leader who can be witty in crisis has a special currency. It buys smiles in a world otherwise bankrupt of hope. Let me pivot to the absurd human detail, because human beings love the ridiculous faces of their heroes. Picture the Prime Minister, infamous appetite intact, consuming breakfast in bed, marmalade, scones, eggs like tiny suns, and yet always interruptible by urgent news. Food in that environment becomes a ritualistic anchor, a signal to staff. He is beginning his day. To interrupt that is to summon thunder. You will find in the margins of history that many of the most decisive calls were made between bites. The proximity of sustenance and diplomacy forms a humorous, almost grotesque ballet. The handing over of the biscuit tin followed by dispatching fleets. Finally, let's be blunt. Working from bed half the day reflects the gritty fact that power is not purely a function of uprightness. It is a function of the mind's capacity to harness circumstance, of the will to reframe weakness as method. Churchill's horizontal hours were a strategy of resilience, a means to conserve and invest energy where it mattered. In speeches, decisions, moral leadership, they were not a renunciation of responsibility, but a particular style of meeting that responsibility on his own terms. If you're still with me, here's a question to drop in the comments. What would you do if history depended on your nap schedule? Tell me your funniest or most absurd survival trick in the face of stress. Did you work from bed, like Churchill, or did you have another ritual that saved you? I'll read the best ones and weave them into the next part, where we go deeper into the specific mornings that defined the man. The telegram that woke him like a thunderclap, the visit that forced him to rise, the night where sleep was a prisoner, and victory a possibility. Spoiler, one of those mornings involved a biscuit tin, a broken clock, and an order that nearly reshaped a continent. We haven't yet reached the darkest corners where the bed becomes shrink and confession booth, where decisions made under covers haunt a man in the daylight. Part 2 will follow the trail of particular mornings and misread signals, when being horizontal was also a liability, when the world almost slipped through the sheets because the man gripping it had chosen to clutch his pillow instead. For now, imagine the scene. The phone rings, the country waits, and the man in the dressing gown answers with a cough and a sentence that will be remembered. It is simultaneously the most sensible and most absurd tactic in history, surviving by reclining. Wake up and imagine the Prime Minister answering the phone with one hand, an egg on a spoon in the other, hair in gentle rebellion, and a face that has practiced defiance in the mirror for decades. Hook, the most urgent message of the morning, could arrive on a silver tray, and he would sign the fate of a fleet between mouthfuls of marmalade. If that sounds ridiculous, perfect, because history often is ridiculous, and Churchill made absurdity into policy. Stay with me. Comment below what ridiculous ritual you would insist on if the fate of nations depended on your breakfast table, and I'll read the best ones in the next episode. Part 2 opens in the small hours when London is not yet brave enough to show its face. The city is a bruise of damp lamplight. The war rooms breathe below like an anxious animal. Above ground, on a hill of heavy curtains and heavier opinions, a bedroom lamp burns like a lighthouse. The man in that bed is not sleeping the sleep of the innocent. He is sampling states of consciousness like a sommelier tastes bad wine. A little nap here, a quick doze there, each one taken with the solemnity of a ceremonial offering. This is the era of tactical languor, where strategic naps are not moral failings but instruments of survival. Mornings begin with theater. He does not simply rise, he stages an emergence. There is a slow, deliberate uncurling, a hand reaching for the telephone, a cigar retrieved as if it were a scepter, a robe cast like a banner. Servants move through the room with the discreet choreography of those who have learned their lines and dare not improvise. Newspapers are arranged with the care of liturgical texts. Telegrams lie in neat piles like confessions waiting to be absolved. To enter the bedchamber is to enter a liminal space between private reactions and public commands. Decisions made here are baptized in the smell of tobacco and tea. In this part of the story, we spend time with the machinery of the morning, the cast that makes the bed office work. There is the nurse who knows where the pain will flare that day, the aide who balances the paperweight of responsibility, the secretary who types as if racing the heartbeat of history itself. Each character in this microcosm has been assigned a psychological function as much as a job title. The nurse administers calm, the aide administers panic with tact, the secretary administers an unblinking stream of words to make ephemeral thoughts concrete. They are co-conspirators in a small civil war against exhaustion, and there are rituals, many of them. Health is tended like a state secret. He would sometimes be examined by a doctor who made bedside rounds like a general inspecting troops. The examination is brief but thorough, a polite invasion of privacy that simultaneously humanizes and weaponizes vulnerability. The Prime Minister would accept prescriptions, raps, poultices, and the occasional paternal lecture on the hazards of indulgence. The doctor's presence has the curious effect of sanctifying the bed. It becomes both infirmary and command post, a place where pain and policy handshake awkwardly on the pillow. Now, imagine the arrival of a message that will rattle the breakfast tray. Walls are thin, shoes hush on carpets. The phone is a small thunderclap. He picks up, and the ordinary tone of domesticity fractures into a language of codes and catastrophes. There is brilliance and cruelty in the way routine and rupture collide. 1 minute you are deliberating on the precise temperature of your tea. The next you are weaving the fate of thousands into a single sentence. It's like watching a juggler swap oranges for live grenades without blinking. In those moments, lying down is not surrender. It is a tactical rearrangement of one's resources. From bed, the Prime Minister speaks with the voice he reserves for oratory. Calm, economical, and with the practiced cadence of someone who has sold a country on the idea of hope before breakfast. He dictates as if to a clairvoyant, names, coordinates, orders, reassurances. The stenographer sits nearby like an acolyte, transcribing the small miracles of thought into paper that will travel faster than any messenger. The bed's softness seems to sharpen the intellect. The constraints of lying down sculpt precision out of verbosity. Where you might rant, lying horizontally forces you into economy of phrase. Let us consider the diplomatic theater that enters the bed like a curious guest. Ambassadors and generals do not always relish the decadence of the bedchamber. It undercuts the rigid, erect protocols they cherish. A diplomat accustomed to the pomp of state must recalibrate when confronted by slippers and a half-eaten scone. But recalibrate they do, because when a leader is steady in his eccentricity, he turns that eccentricity into authority. The visitor's discomfort is a currency to be spent. You walk into pajamas and you leave with a story to tell about the man who conquered you without making you stand. It is a soft coup, a colonization of prestige by mere domesticity. There are mornings, too, where bed proves a vulnerability. The mind that can marshal fleets from the bedroom can also be slowed by pain that anchors the body. This part of the tale is not romantic, it is severe. The Prime Minister, for all his theatrical brilliance, was a man susceptible to physical collapse. When a head swims or a limb rebels, lying down ceases to be tactical and becomes a trap. The enemy does not need to storm your bed. They need only make the condition of your body worse than the condition of your office. The bed is therefore a place of both power and peril, Occupying it is a balancing act where one misstep can tip governance into crisis. Let's step into a particularly absurd morning. A courier arrives with grim intelligence, maps, casualty counts, perhaps a cipher that smacks like a riddle. He opens the envelope with an expression that could be read as sorrow or amusement. Both are useful. He orders tea, always tea, and instructs staff to set a second blanket. He reads, nods, and then does something astonishing. He calls for music. The radio is switched on, and a Chopin nocturne begins to float across the curtains. You might think it a distraction, a refusal to face the brutal arithmetic, or you might see it as a psychological tactic. Music steadies emotion, softens panic, opens a mental window for clearer judgment. In the middle of crisis, he insists on beauty. That insistence is not indulgence. It is a declaration that civilization will not be surrendered, even when tactics demand the savagery of war. The bed is also the place where private demons pace at night. There are sleepless hours when the man wrestles not with logistics, but with the moral calculus that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Guilt cues for its turn at the bedside like a polite mourner. He has dreams in which maps rearrange themselves into faces, in which the decisions he has made walk back into the room and ask for justification. At dawn, he rises, not because he has slept, but because he has reasoned himself into temporary truce with conscience. There is an almost unbearable humanity here, of a leader who must choose and live with choice. It is the most savage kind of loneliness, choosing between horrors and finding secondary horrors in the relief. The linguistic economy he practiced from bed produces speech that will be recorded and repeated. He understands phrase as weapon and as balm, and lying down seems to give him the time to hone epigrams into instruments. A sentence spoken between bites becomes a headline that lucent morning papers will polish like metals. The bed's constraints force compression. Long habit-forming oratory is tempered into compressive clarity. It's a stern stylistic teacher. As a result, the man who sometimes looked like he was loafing on a pillow crafted aphorisms that tightened the nation's nerve. There is a perverse efficiency in that. The less you can gesticulate, the more the words must do the work of galvanizing. Of course, the bed office creates a new etiquette. Visitors adjust their manner like actors facing a director's caprice. The Prime Minister's private life, once sacrosanct, becomes a stage device. This can be abused. Rivals will call the bed a sign of frailty and write obscenely clever lines in private letters about national leadership done in nightwear. But criticism is also a kind of conversation. If you can turn your eccentricity into a brand, you control the interpretation. He did that with the ruthless skill of a showman. He allowed cameras onto his terrain sometimes, making public images of tiredness into mythic portraits of courage that included moments of rest as well as moments of action. Part 2 is also where we glimpse the strange, small economies of survival. There are cupboards devoted to biscuits. There are little rituals of placement, napkins folded just so, a particular cup kept for mornings when letters threaten to drown the world. Staffers invent shorthand for his moods based on whether he asks for toast or marmalade. These domestic coordinates map onto strategy. The day's temperament can be read like a weather report from the breakfast tray. If he wants toast crisp to a certain degree, expect sharper language in the afternoon. If he lingers over porridge, expect more conciliatory memos. Whether you believe it or not, these were psychological barometers used by those closest to him to anticipate the next political storm. Now, let us not romanticize. There are ludicrous moments. A dignitary once arrived expecting state solemnity and found the Prime Minister debating the merits of a new pair of slippers. The foreign envoy was polite but visibly unnerved. The exchange reads like a sketch. The envoy clears his throat. The Prime Minister attempts to assess whether the slippers complement his robe. The envoy then proposes a treaty. The treaty is negotiated between foot measurements and a sip of tea. This is the grotesque theater of power. It is absurd, and yet it works because those who enter that room leave convinced they have been seen in all their awkward, human, petty magnificence. Seeing breeds trust. Trust breeds compliance. You should also picture the bed as a laboratory of empathy. When a leader presents himself as suffering yet functioning, he invites sympathy not only from allies, but from the whole organism of governance. Ministers lean in, the public leans in. This is an artful manipulation. Show your frailty and you will be tended, But far from weakness, it becomes leverage. The choice to be visibly human, ailments, anxieties, the occasional tear, softens opposition and stiffens loyalty. It is a social alchemy, and it is here we see the wily calculation at the heart of bed office politics, displaying pain without surrender so that the nation will feel both compassion and admiration. The afternoons that follow such mornings are often a different species. By noon, the bed office ritual may have produced decisions that will be weaponized into action. Orders are dispatched, memos sent, ships alerted. By lying down, he has performed the quiet labor of synthesis, taking disparate, contradictory inputs and compressing them into coherent policy. Others will stride to meetings to enact what he has already distilled from the pillow. The bed is the pre-briefing, the cabinet room is the battlefield. Energy is parceled out like scarce currency. Conserve where you can, spend where you must. But there are also the dark times, those mornings when the bed does not make you sharp but softens your resolve, when prolonged rest breeds indecision. Those around him notice the telltale signs, longer pauses, a fumbling over names, the slipping clarity that had once been his daily currency. Decisiveness is the hardest habit to keep. It requires both vigor and a willingness to accept the weight of choice. When pain or fatigue erode the will, the bed becomes both refuge and snare. A leader who prefers the comfort of being horizontal risks a creeping erosion of authority. Staff must be vigilant. They must know when to prompt and when to push. Here's a vignette you'll like. A late morning summons from a general who expects a crisp answer about an amphibious landing. The Prime Minister, muffled in blankets, listens while spooning porridge, and then, with a sudden spark, dictates an order that dazzles with its audacity. The general, initially affronted, becomes electrified. He will remember the moment not because of the bed, but because the answer was right. This is the core paradox. The sight of least formality can produce the most radical form of clarity. The bed, in its vulnerability, can produce courage. So what should the viewer take away while you scroll to the comment section to tell me your own pre-battle breakfast ritual? Here's the lean truth. Working from bed half the day is less spectacle and more strategy. It is an adaptation of a human organism under extreme pressure. It is also a kind of performance art, a calculated mixture of weakness and potency that bends social instinct toward compliance. It is theater, biology, and cunning stitched together with the thread of necessity. Before we close this second part, let me return to the personal, a private, almost shameful detail. There is a particular morning when a small domestic indignity almost upends a great plan. A kettle overboils, scalding steam like a tiny, furious volcano. A dog snuffles under the covers, a vase topples and breaks. The petty disasters of home intrude upon global strategy. The man in bed only laughs because laughter is a weapon as honest as any cannon. He arranges the broken porcelain like a general rearranging his lines, takes another sip of tea, and goes on. The world keeps asking for miracles. He gives it small, stubborn domestic acts that add up to defiance. Now, comment below. Tell me the strangest or funniest ritual you'd insist on if you had to hold a nation together between bites of breakfast. Would you demand a drummer in the hallway, a personal foghorn, a daily recital of bad poetry to remind yourself of human absurdity? Best answers will be read aloud, like honors in part 3, which will follow with darker mornings and an instance when the bed nearly lost its commander to a sudden collapse of health. For now, imagine the scene. The phone rings, the curtains tremble, and beneath it all a man in slippers signs the order that will maybe tilt history. It's theatrical, it's human, and it's terribly, beautifully absurd. The phone rings like an accusation. He answers with one eye open, a cigar threatening mutiny, and signs an order that will change lives before he finishes his spoonful of porridge. If that doesn't make you laugh and shiver at once, keep watching. Then tell me in the comments the strangest thing you'd insist on while running a country. There are mornings that are merely difficult. Then there are mornings that rearrange the furniture of your life and demand you invent new verbs for surviving them. This is one of those mornings. The dawn arrives as a bruise, the sky still resentful of being asked to attend to business. Curtains are drawn against the polite indifference of light. In the bedchamber, a man who has become a national theater of contradiction presides like the worn conductor of a very messy orchestra. Outside, London coughs out its newspapers. Below, the war rooms hum. Above, The pillows are an archipelago of decisions. He wakes with a headache, as if the previous night's arguments have lodged themselves in his skull and set up an unnecessary government there. The pain is not a polite guest. It is a squat, determined tenant that refuses to leave. It climbs into his joints and whispers of past battles and past indulgences. Too much ports, too many cigars, too many small victories eaten like desserts. He becomes, in the privatist sense of the term, a medical spectacle. This is not the theatrical, prearranged ailment that once made for compelling photographs. This is the kind of collapse that arrives uninvited and threatens to make the curtains look like a shroud. A nurse arrives with the quiet authority of someone who has held many bodies together that men wish to keep whole for reasons other than vanity. She is efficient with her sympathy, which is to say, she doesn't waste it. She takes his pulse and makes calculations in the same way a general consults a map, with a mix of elegance and impatience. The men in the room exchange small looks, the kind that have fewer words but contain entire policy memos. People who work within the orbit of power develop a language of glances. It substitutes for questions too dangerous to speak aloud. There is a telegram. There is always a telegram. The courier, the man with the clipped mustache and the solemn eyes, practices his own sort of theater when he crosses the threshold. This is the ritual handover of thunder. He lays the paper on the bedside table like something fragile and obscene. The Prime Minister's hand trembles when he takes it, which is partly the headache and partly the fact that the handwriting on the paper smells like war. He reads, the letters swim, maps distort. He sets the telegram down and closes his eyes, not in sleep, but in calculation. The kind that looks like rest to those who mistake stillness for surrender. It is then that the great collapse arrives. Not the cinematic swoon of melodrama, nor the genteel fainting of an Edwardian novel, but the slow, mechanical betrayal of a body that has been unpaid for too long. A muscle spasms in his leg like a trapped thought. The left side of his face grows rebellious with numbness. Speech stumbles like a horse in mud. A mind that has been the engine of wartime rhetoric coughs and loses gear. For a moment, a long and cold moment, the bed that had been his throne seems to be conspiring with the sickness to undo him. There is panic, and then there is the efficient panic of a government that has rehearsed emergencies in rooms with far less charm. Assistants move, a choreography rehearsed by terror and long practice. A cold compress here, a measured dose of something there, a phone pressed into a collarbone like a foreign body. The nurse speaks in clipped commands. A doctor arrives, his face a map of nights spent awake over other men's lives. There is a quick, clinical assessment and a code word floated across the pillows that sets in motion a series of small, astonishing miracles. Doctors summoned, messages routed, the telephone line kept alive like an IV. What follows is not merely care but theater, because somewhere between the bedside and the war rooms, a perception battle is being fought. A leader's collapse is not merely a private tragedy, it is a public currency. Should the site leak, and leaks are the mundane weapons of war, morale would wobble like a plate on an unsteady table. So those around him must enact a double duty, to treat the man and to manage the story of his treatability. They must be doctors and dramaturgers at once, wielding gray coats and brighter prose. A patient is bandaged, a narrative is rehearsed. He does not die. The man is stubborn in the way of people who inherit other people's hope, but the shock leaves a mark like a burn. His voice returns unevenly. Words that used to be weapons now feel like blunt instruments. He learns that morning that his cognition stalls sometimes like a machine that needs warming up. Short-term memory plays hide-and-seek with him. Faces that were yesterday's acquaintances now demand introductions. The world, which had been his canvas of quips and barbed asides, begins to look like a puzzle with missing pieces. Recovery, for him, is a ragged apprenticeship. He must relearn how to trap an idea and pin it down before it slips under the bedclothes of fatigue. Doctors recommend rest. Advisors murmur the words delegation and convalescence as if they are recipes to be followed. He bristles because he has always equated authority with presence. To be absent, even for reasons of infirmity, is to give narrative to critics. So the compromise emerges. The bed will remain the center of activity, not because it is comfortable, but because it is where he can be most himself within his new limits. This afternoon shifts the geography of power. Previously, the bed had been a place where he could work horizontally while letting others do the running. Now it becomes a laboratory for reinvention. He learns to deliver orders in shorter bursts, to employ epigrams like stitches. The staff around him develop a new skill set. They become filters for his attention, choosing which crisis demands the full battery of his remaining energy, and which must be rehearsed through drafts and typed memos. This is triage for a different intestine, the organ that digests information. There is a blackly funny moment because absurdity insists on arriving at the most terrible times. A senior official, not yet comfortable with this new fragile man under the covers, insists on the sanctity of certain rituals. He arrives with an obsequious portfolio of inspection and policy, expecting the brisk interrogation he's come to know. He is confronted instead by a scene. The Prime Minister in a dressing gown, one shoe untied, dictating in starts and stops, and a radio playing something that might be Chopin or possibly supermarket music. The official fidgets, then makes the fateful error of lowering his voice in an attempt to be deferential. He ends up telling a joke, the wrong kind of joke, which, in the small theater of the bedside, lands like a dropped tray. The Prime Minister smiles painfully, then swats the air with the precision of a man who knows how to return a blow. The official leaves enlightened and chastened. The bed is no place for bad humor. Weeks pass like slow, grudging allies. The man learns new rhythms. He learns to nap not only for escape, but for cunning. Brief sleep becomes an incubation chamber for clarity. He discovers cognitive routines that are less dramatic, but more dependable. 20 minutes of bluish nap, an intake of quiet, then 10 minutes of dictation where everything that matters is squeezed down into tight phrases. He learns to deploy humor differently, using fewer words, but with a scalpel's edge. The public notices a change in cadence, and many mistake it for aging gravitas. In truth, it is adaptation. The cabinet watches with a mix of dread and gratitude. Some fear that the man who used to tower verbally is now a brittle object that could be broken by rumor. Others see in his persistence a moral victory. He will not go. He will not cede the bed entirely. And in doing so, he demonstrates something the populace refuses to abandon. A leader who continues, though imperfectly, to shoulder the burden. Politics is often a theater of optics. The sight of a leader enduring, even imperfectly, is a balm. People want to see that someone is willing to be damaged for them. It is twisted, but it works. One afternoon, a strikingly human scene unfolds that will not appear in formal dispatches, but will live in the gossip of servants and the margins of diaries. A child, belonging to a relative visiting from the countryside, slips into the chamber, drawn by curiosity. Children have a moral crudity adults lack. They do not parse decorum. She clambers onto the bed and tugs at his sleeve. For a moment, the man who commands fleets and alliances is reduced to the simplicity of a hand held by a child. He laughs, not the brittle, rhetorical laugh of a statesman, but an honest, surprised sound that cracks the room wide open. For those 5 minutes, the wound of political life is patched not by policy, but by play. But the political machine frets. Opponents whisper in the alleyways of the press. Satirists sharpen their pencils. There is talk of a bedroom coalition that governs by blanket and biscuit. The narrative becomes a battlefield in itself. The Prime Minister, always a showman even when ill, decides to weaponize the perception. He allows controlled glimpses of his vulnerability, framing them not as surrender but as sacrifice. Photographs are timed, speeches are written with the knowledge that each sentence will be weighed against the fact he delivered it from a lounger. He practices the art of appearing diminished and yet indomitable, a feat of branding perfected at a time when branding was called rhetoric. A crisis arrives, one that presses like a thumb on the throat of the nation. An operation planned in secret must be greenlit, risks weighed and counterweighted. The generals want a crisp answer. The men in the war rooms wish to see the steel in the brow of their leader. He is, by now, attuned to the rhythm of such demands. He calls for a map, not because he needs to stand before it, but because he recognizes the ritual. The map comes like a stage prop. He traces divisions with a finger as if the world were a plate of geography to be carefully portioned. He gives the order, not as a thunderclap, but as a sewn seam. Precise, measured, near to the point of clinical. The generals who receive it are both reassured and unnerved. The man who once thundered now plans like a surgeon. There are nights when dreams return like creditors. He fights them in small ways. A walk past the study lamp, a reprieve taken with a glass of hot milk, A few lines of poetry read aloud to grope for something steady in the dark. People ask if he will finally concede and sleep. He will not. The bed has become both bed and cathedral, place of frailty and of transfiguration. The man reclaims his narrative by refusing to play the role others assign him. If he is to be tired, he will be tired with purpose. If he is to be weak, he will use his weakness as a conduit for more durable strengths. Stubbornness, wit, the ability to compress will into words that can act as orders. The staff develops a vocabulary of micro-protective lies. He is up and about, they tell the public, when the truth is, he will be up in a moment after yet another consult. It is a small betrayal in service of something larger, a nation's need for steady eyes. The truth is that leadership, in its more demanding versions, sometimes requires a collective choreography of concealment, not because of cowardice, but because facts can be instruments of harm when wielded without care. And then, one night, the man sleeps in the kind of sleep that argues with triumph. The doctors have called it a remission of sorts. The politicians call it a reprieve. He wakes with a clarity that tastes like victory. Not the victory of battle, but the victory of continuing to stand despite the love affair his body has with collapse. He walks, at least a little, and that short movement is celebrated like the return of summer. The newspapers write of courage, the cartoons mock, the nation breathes. It is a fragile truce, but it is one that must be honored. He, for his part, accepts it with the humility of someone who knows how close he came to being taken off the stage. We close this part with a thought and a question. Surviving the modern world requires not merely endurance, but adaptability, the capacity to convert fragility into instrument. He became not merely a man who worked from bed, but a strategist of limitation, someone who could make the pillow a site of governance and the nap an engine of invention. It was not nobility that saved him, but stubbornness, not spectacle, but a repertoire of small, precise actions. Now, it's your turn. Write in the comments the one tiny, ridiculous ritual you would refuse to give up if you were trying to hold everything together. A favorite biscuit, a bad joke before each meeting, a pet that must be in the room. Best answers will be read aloud in part 4, where we go deeper into the moral cost of reclining while nations trembled and reveal a morning that will test the bed's power like never before. The phone rings like an accusation. He answers with a woolen fist clenched to his robe, a cigar that has staged a minor rebellion in his mouth, and with a voice still half sunk in dream tells a general to hold nothing back. If you think that sounds blasé, listen. In that one horizontal breath, a nation's fate is signed, argued, and occasionally misread. Would you trust someone in slippers more than someone in a uniform? Say so in the comments. I want to know whether you think courage is posture or persistence. There is a final morning that will decide everything. It does not arrive with trumpet fanfare or a dramatic montage. It slips in mundanely like a bill shoved under a door. The sky is a thin verdict of gray. Outside, the city masks itself in the ordinary sounds of delivery carts and hurried boots. Inside, the bed, that ridiculous, sacrosanct pile of cushions and veils, waits like a stage set that has been rehearsed into reality. The Prime Minister, who has made an art form of reclining, wakes with an ache that feels less like pain than like a memory of pain demanding to be taken seriously. His limbs protest with the same petulant eloquence his speeches once deployed against tyrants. He knows, in the soft calculus a man learns when he has been using his body as a battlefield for decades, that this day could be critical. What he does not know, no one does, is how exactly the world will demand the very thing he has tried to hide, uprightness. It begins small and victimless, a cipher misunderstood by someone in a basement room a dozen floors below. A clerk, tired and underpaid, transposes 2 numbers. In the oily wheels of bureaucracy, such errors are usually corrected by routine. Today, the mistake lodges like a splinter in the mechanism. Orders meant for diversion are sent to the front line. A fleet is informed of a false rendezvous. By the time the mistake is noticed, the clock has moved with its terrible, indifferent cruelty. Lives are now attached to a misprinted coordinate. The war rooms explode into a choreography of alarm. People who have practiced calm begin to behave like people. Papers are moved like flocks. Voices that usually hold a steady timbre begin to shake. Meanwhile, in bed, a telegram arrives that looks, to anyone not trained in the cold language of codes, like a flat, bureaucratic thing. To him, it reads like a detonator. He opens it, and because he has made a habit of working from a horizontal posture. He reads it slowly, translating numbers into narrative in his head as one translates a dry grocery list into a meal. The room hums. A colonel on the line asks for immediate direction. A general requests a decision that will bite into maps and men. The prime minister weighs options: pull men back and risk a rout, commit reserves and risk overextension, order a feint and gamble on deception. Each choice has a ledger of human costs. This is the moment where the bed's strategic virtues and vices are thrown into high relief. From the pillow, he can access decades of knowledge, a Rolodex of faces, and an economy of language sharpened by constraints. He can compress decisions into elegant sentences that travel swiftly and carry authority. But lying down is also a physical removal. It introduces a lag, a need to double-check, to rely on others for motion and immediacy few have, to trust that the world will respect the commands of a man who is not standing. In that lag, history can slip between the sheets. The political rivals smell the fissure immediately, and they are not gentle animals. Whispers begin as whispers must. A footnote in a memo, a snide remark at a club, a cartoon in a paper. The bedroom cabinet, they snicker. The prime minister who rules from slippers. It is cheap ammunition, but political wars are won by supply lines of cheapness. Opponents fan the sparks of rumor into a small conflagration. Could a man who spends half his day horizontal be trusted to make the split-second calls war sometimes demands? The press, hungry for the soft flesh of scandal, begins to audition for pulpits with their teeming headlines. The public, being both sentimental and fearful, believes everything and nothing in equal measure. Back in the bedchamber, the prime minister feels the pressure like a band tightening. He can see the pattern of the misdirected order unfurling across the map. A squadron sailing for the wrong bay, a landing party moving at the precise speed of disaster. He must choose whether to risk the lives currently in motion by issuing a countermand midstream, or to allow the current to play out and attempt rescue after the fact. It is not a question you can answer with slogans or with the theatrical clarity of a speech. It is arithmetic and famine and the kind of moral calculus that lodges like a pebble in the shoe of your conscience. He calls his chiefs and the exchange is compressed, clipped. Hold, he tells the fleet. If confirmation does not arrive in 15, assume false rendezvous. His voice is a scalpel. His commands are short and exact. He trusts the men who move and the men who will bear the smallest physical burdens of his words. But the world is messy. The message gets delayed. Radios fail. There are storms where wires once lay like obedient lanes. Men at sea read orders in the light of dawn and interpret them as breathless imperatives. The delay slices the options into narrower and more brutal bands. He delegates certain motions, trusting those whose legs do the walking. He orders a diversion in another sector, hoping the deception will buy the needed hours. Each order is a pebble thrown into a pond whose ripples reach coasts with unknown appetite. At a particular moment, a subordinate suggests a solution that feels morally tawdry. Allow the misdirected squadron to continue, and send a rescue force that will accept even greater risk. The logic is raw and terrible and pragmatic. It spares an immediate surrender of face, but it may cost more lives. It is the sort of suggestion history judges cruelly or cleverly depending on outcomes. The prime minister hears it, chews the end of his cigar like a man weighing the last slice of bread, and chooses instead to issue a bold or risky order. Redirect the squadron immediately, even if that means some may be stranded until rescue can reach them. The choice will be judged by survivors and by the dead. The decision made from the bed ripples outward. Men at sea alter their headings. Radios crackle. Later, when the fog clears and historians pick over the bones of the event, they will call it either a masterstroke or a bungled gamble. But in that moment, the moral cost is immediate and visceral. Letters arrive at the bedside asking for names. Mothers send pleas that read like prayers. A nurse comes and stands in the doorway with a face the color of hospital curtains. The prime minister writes names on a small pad because the bureaucracy requires this cruelty. He signs the order. He can imagine the faces of the men who will answer that call. He imagines their wives imagining the call they will one day receive. The weight of a leader's signature is heavier when written in ink, and when known to be written from a place of comfort. It is here the irony stabs. The bed had been a bastion of survival, a way to be present while conserving the very energy required for leadership. It had allowed him to endure long enough to make brilliant, luminous calls, but the bed also sheltered him from the direct sensory feedback of command. He could not smell salt air from the deck, could not feel the tremble of a ship under attack beneath his boots. That sensory insulation makes moral calculus abstract. It makes it possible to order lives without immediacy of consequence, which is both a strategic boon and a moral hazard. Decisions become clean on paper but messy in flesh. In the aftermath, when the immediate crisis is contained, the nation breathes a temporary, nervous sigh of relief. The press, having indulged in its peccadillos, now spins praise for the decisiveness that bought them time. Critics who had leaned in for the kill find themselves browbeaten by the narrative of resolution. But the personal cost to the man in bed is profound. Sleep will not come easily. He will dream of maps folding in on themselves. He will hear radio static in moments of silence. He will be haunted by the knowledge that his horizontal posture, once framed as cunning, allowed a dangerous lag to occur. There is politics to pay as well. Parliament men, remembering their own ambitions and their own need for stature, demand inquiries. Loyalty is a thin ice on which even friends skate when the nation looks confused. The Prime Minister must weather hearings where reasons are parsed with the sharpness of scalpels. He must navigate accusations of negligence leveled like thrown gloves. He defends himself with that rhetorical craft that has been honed on the pillow. Clarity, concision, and appeal to shared sacrifice. "We rode the storm," he says. "We acted with the best information we possessed." The line is both true and evasive. It is the language leaders use when they must ask others to carry the cost of decisions. And yet, there is a private price that no inquiry can measure: the erosion of self-trust. He begins to wonder whether the very strategy that preserved him, the bed as office, is itself a betrayal of the moral weight his office requires. He asks in the quiet hours whether leadership is merely about surviving long enough to make decisions, or whether it also demands a bodily presence that reflects the gravity of those choices. He sees that the spectacle of a man who will not rise can be inspiring in a time of despair, but it can also be a dangerous precedent. If leaders normalize withdrawal under the guise of efficiency, then a culture of evasive governance can take root. The medical staff, who had once enabled the bed office with sympathetic pragmatism, now advise stricter regimes. They hand him timetables like penitential books. "Stand when you can," they say. "Walk, even if for a few steps." He protests with all the snark of a man who has made eccentricity into authority. He insists, too, on dignity. He will not be staged for cheap sympathy, but the truth is quieter. He will try to be more upright, because he knows the cost of being otherwise. He will not surrender the pleasures of the pillow, but he will reorder them. He will insist on presence when presence matters most. There are moral lessons stitched into the aftermath that speak louder than the headlines. The bed is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used to build or to hide. When a leader uses vulnerability transparently, as a way of aligning with the public, as a means of modeling perseverance, it can deepen the moral contract between ruler and ruled. When vulnerability serves as a cover for abdication, it erodes legitimacy. The line between the two is thin, drawn in the daily ledger of actions and consequences. By the time the sun sets on that dire day, the man in bed has learned something that is both humble and terrible. Leadership is not only about making decisions, it is about being visibly present for the consequences. His decision had been decisive. It had also cost. He writes letters that are formulaic in public, but intimate in private, apologizing not because he misjudged, but because he feels the human cost acutely. He begins to meet survivors, and in the eyes that look up at him he finds both the justification for his actions and the endless toll those actions extract from any soul entrusted with power. What happens next is not a tidy moral victory. There are no cinematic reconciliations where the crowd chants his name and the cameras catch a triumphant, upright stride. There is instead a slow cultural negotiation about the nature of authority, one that involves humor and satire and late-night jabs, but also, discordantly, gratitude. People will say he saved a peninsula, others will whisper that he gambled with lives. Both are true at once. History prefers such paradoxes. They are richer to chew than simple moralities. So where does that leave us, watching from the present, where chairs and sofas have replaced palaces of steel? It leaves us with a question that is both intimate and political. When the world demands everything, what part of our humanity are we permitted to conserve? Is it permissible to protect the self so that the self may be useful later? Or does protection risk abdicating the moral immediacy leadership sometimes demands? Vote in the comments, cunning or cowardice, survival tactic or dangerous precedent. If the bed saved him, it also nearly undid him. It was a shelter, a stage, and ultimately a test. He survived the test, but not unmarked. In the end, he learned to treat the bed as a contingency rather than a default, a tool to be used with the same ethical deliberation he applied to every military maneuver. He kept his slippers and his cigars, but he learned to rise when the world insisted that someone stand. Now, tell me in the comments what you think. Did his horizontal genius make him a better leader, or did it almost cost the country everything? Share your funniest or most vehemently moral take, and I'll read the sharpest ones aloud for the next piece of absurd history I make into a story. If history is a nightmare we keep waking into, perhaps our rituals are the only measure we have. Maybe the most honest thing we can do is confess which ones we'd keep if we had to hold the world together between bites. Imagine a dictator, swollen with ego, who honestly believed that the fate of his nation could be shaped not only by tanks and decrees, but by his own trembling attempt at a high C. Yes, Benito Mussolini, the man who dragged Italy through a theatrical nightmare of parades and propaganda, genuinely thought he could sing opera, not as a joke, not as a hobby, but as a divine gift bestowed upon him in his mind by history itself. If you had to rate his delusion on a scale from mild karaoke embarrassment to invade Ethiopia, where would you put it? Leave your score in the comments, because after this you might reconsider what real madness sounds like. It began, as most of Mussolini's bad ideas did, with a mirror. In the early 1920s, Il Duce stood before his reflection in some over-decorated government residence. His chest puffed out like a coiled brass instrument. The world had been deprived for too long of his voice. This was a man who never encountered silence without suspecting it was a conspiracy. To him, words were weapons, speeches were battles, and music, well, music was just another battlefield he had yet to conquer. And why not? Italy was the birthplace of opera. If Rome could conquer the known world, surely its self-appointed Caesar could conquer Puccini. His advisors, poor devils, had learned long ago that the fastest way to stay alive was to nod like terrified metronomes. So when Mussolini announced that he would be taking vocal lessons for the good of the nation, no one dared suggest that perhaps the good of the nation would be better served if its leader didn't spend hours a day trying to outsing Caruso. The Minister of Culture even called it a patriotic act, which in Mussolini's Italy was less a compliment and more a survival tactic, and so began the rehearsals. The palace became an opera house in miniature. Curtains were drawn, not to block light, but to improve acoustics, or at least that's what Mussolini insisted. Servants tiptoed through the corridors, straining to avoid the sound of their leader attempting to leap an octave and failing with the grace of a falling sandbag. Imagine the sonic violence. A man with the lungs of a tyrant, the self-control of a toddler, and the pitch accuracy of a foghorn. Yet, to Mussolini, each cracked note was not a mistake, but a heroic experiment. One evening, he summoned his closest circle to what he called a private recital. The guests arrived in formal wear, half expecting a policy meeting, half fearing some new declaration of war. Instead, they found Mussolini, standing before them in a tailored black suit, a single spotlight illuminating his shaved head like a marble bust under interrogation. A pianist was stationed in the corner, eyes wide with the haunted look of someone who had already rehearsed with him for 3 hours that afternoon. Tonight, Mussolini announced, I will gift you the voice of Italy. He raised his arms as if to embrace the heavens, then launched into Nessun Dorma with the subtlety of an artillery barrage. The first note startled a diplomat so badly that he dropped his wineglass. By the third verse, 2 ministers were visibly sweating, not from heat, but from the physical exertion of maintaining an expression that wouldn't get them executed. The performance ended with Mussolini holding a final note that neither Puccini nor physics would have approved of, his face flushed red, veins straining like ropes on a sinking ship. He was ecstatic. You see, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Opera is the purest form of leadership. When the people hear this, they will know they are in the hands of a maestro. Not a single person contradicted him, though one general reportedly muttered under his breath, if the people hear this, they will flee the country. From that night on, Singing became part of Mussolini's daily routine, wedged between military briefings and speeches from balconies. There are stories, whispered at first, later written down with equal parts horror and glee, of him practicing arias in full military uniform, gesturing at imaginary audiences as if every window in Rome were a theater box. He even began to toy with the idea of incorporating live singing into his speeches. The thought of him breaking into La Donna Immobile in the middle of a foreign policy address is enough to make history itself sweat. The army, meanwhile, had its own opinion on the matter. Soldiers stationed near government buildings reported that drills were sometimes drowned out by the sound of Il Duce belting from his office. One officer swore he saw a group of pigeons abandon the square entirely, as if fleeing an approaching storm. And yet, Mussolini remained convinced that his voice had the power to inspire troops, unite citizens, and terrify enemies. Perhaps the most absurd chapter came when he attempted to arrange a meeting with an actual opera company. His plan? To sing alongside them in a public performance, not as a novelty guest, but as a lead tenor. The director, a man with decades of musical integrity, found himself cornered in Mussolini's office, nodding furiously while calculating how to avoid the inevitable disaster without losing his head. In the end, a scheduling conflict was invented, and the dictator's debut was delayed indefinitely, though not without Mussolini declaring that the world simply wasn't ready for him. The tragedy, or comedy, depending on your tolerance for dictators with delusions, is that Mussolini never seemed to realize how ridiculous he looked. For him, opera was not a pastime, but proof of his own myth, the Renaissance man, the warrior poet, the leader whose genius overflowed into every human art. In his mind, his voice was the sound of a nation in bloom. In reality, it was the sound of one man's ego echoing through marble halls, too loud for anyone to tell him the truth. Tell me, if you had been in that audience, would you have clapped like your life depended on it, or risked honesty in the face of Il Duce's aria? Drop your answer in the comments because I'm curious. How far would you go to survive a dictator's recital? Mussolini's opera ambitions might have stayed a private embarrassment if not for his irresistible urge to export them, like bad wine or worse policy, beyond Italy's borders. The moment he realized he could inflict his talent on the international stage, diplomacy itself became an unintended hostage situation. Foreign ministers came to Rome expecting tense negotiations over treaties and trade, only to find themselves cornered in palatial rooms with the acoustics of a cathedral, while Il Duce loomed over them like a human trumpet. The first victim was the French ambassador. He had arrived for a discreet conversation about border tensions, but Mussolini had other plans. "Before we speak of such small matters," he declared, "you must hear the voice of Italy." Without warning, he launched into O Sole Mio, arms outstretched, eyes fixed on the horizon as if serenading the Alps themselves. The ambassador, a man trained to keep a straight face through coups and assassinations, bit his lip so hard he nearly drew blood. Legend has it he later described the performance as an attack without declaration of war, and Mussolini did not limit himself to captive diplomats. At state banquets, the moment wine loosened his throat, the aria would come. Imagine the terror of dignitaries halfway through their soup when the host suddenly throws his napkin aside, leaps to his feet, and begins howling Verdi with the seriousness of a man announcing mobilization. One poor envoy from Yugoslavia reportedly dropped his spoon into the consommé and left it there, frozen in a silent plea for divine intervention. But perhaps the most catastrophic incident came during his meeting with Hitler in the late 1930s. Mussolini had convinced himself that opera could be a political weapon, a means to impress the Führer with Italy's cultural supremacy. So, in the middle of their talks, he rose from his chair, cleared his throat like a man about to announce a declaration of empire, and began to sing. Hitler, to his credit or eternal shame, sat there motionless, his expression locked somewhere between bafflement and dread. When Mussolini hit a particularly shaky note, the German leader blinked rapidly, as if praying for an air raid to interrupt the moment. Afterwards, he diplomatically said, "Your passion is clear," which in dictator speak probably meant never do that again. By now, Mussolini had developed a theory that every great leader of history could have been a great singer if they had only tried. Julius Caesar would have been a magnificent baritone, Napoleon, a fiery tenor, obviously. and he, Mussolini, was merely fulfilling this ancient, neglected duty of leadership. He began to weave operatic metaphors into his speeches, as Verdi composed for the heart, so I composed for the destiny of Italy. To the crowd, it sounded grand. To anyone who had actually heard him sing, it sounded like a warning. Back home, his staff was nearing collapse. The pianist assigned to him was now a broken man, living in a constant state of musical siege. He developed a facial twitch every time Mussolini cleared his throat. "It's like being in the artillery," he reportedly confided to a friend. "You don't know when the next salvo will come, only that it will be loud and miss the target." Ministers started bringing urgent matters to Mussolini right before his planned practice sessions, hoping to cut them short. Some feigned illness, others hid, and yet, the more resistance he sensed, the more convinced Mussolini became that his music was a form of truth others feared. He began to suspect that the British, in particular, were trying to suppress his vocal genius as part of a broader anti-Italian conspiracy. "Why else," he demanded, "would they not invite me to sing at their royal functions?" His aides knew the real reason, survival, but no one dared explain it. It was around this time that the dictator decided to record himself. In his mind, the gramophone was a weapon, not of destruction, but of immortality. He imagined his voice preserved for centuries, studied in conservatories alongside Caruso, worshipped by future generations as the sound of Italian greatness. He summoned a team of terrified technicians who assembled the recording equipment under the gaze of the armed guard. The first take was catastrophic. His voice cracked, the piano went out of sync, and halfway through an aria, he forgot the lyrics and filled the gap with an improvised speech about Roman virtue. But Mussolini was undeterred. "Perfection is for the timid," he proclaimed. "History will remember my courage." He insisted the record be pressed anyway, and sent copies to select allies. According to rumor, one copy reached the Vatican, where a certain cardinal used it to scare pigeons off the balcony. Another reportedly ended up in the hands of Winston Churchill, who kept it as an emergency morale booster for his cabinet. Nothing unites people like the shared horror of a dictator attempting Puccini. And still, Mussolini dreamed bigger. If opera could charm diplomats and impress history, why not weaponize it in warfare? There were mutterings, too absurd to be true, yet perfectly believable, that he once considered broadcasting his own singing over the radio to enemy lines, convinced it would demoralize them into surrender. The generals, already accustomed to bizarre orders, quietly shelved the idea before it could be tested. By this point, Il Duce's operatic self-delusion had become a national secret everyone knew. Ordinary Italians whispered about it in cafes, careful to keep their voices down, as if the sound itself might summon him for a surprise performance. If only he had stuck to singing. One farmer sighed years later. He might have done less damage. If you had been one of those diplomats trapped in a gilded room while Mussolini sang at you, what would your survival tactic be? Fake a fainting, spell, or loudly join in to mask the sound? Let me know in the comments, because I'm curious who among you could have survived the most dangerous aria in history. By the time the Second World War was in full swing, Mussolini's operatic ambitions had swollen to grotesque proportions. Like a balloon someone forgot to tie, wobbling dangerously close to bursting. In his mind, the war was not just a conflict of armies and resources, but a cosmic stage upon which he, Il Duce, would perform the greatest role of his life. And if his generals failed to deliver victory on the battlefield, well, perhaps his voice could still deliver glory on the cultural front. The idea began, absurdly enough, during a visit to the front lines in North Africa. Mussolini, dressed in his immaculate military uniform that had never known a grain of desert sand, stood before a weary unit of Italian soldiers. They had been living on rations, enduring heat that could roast a camel, and praying for reinforcement. What they got instead was their leader clearing his throat, announcing, "Men, today I bring you not orders, but art." And before anyone could protest, he launched into Va Pensiero from Verdi's Nabucco, gesturing dramatically at the horizon like the Nile itself was taking notes. The soldiers, trained in endurance but not in this, stood in stunned silence. One later claimed that a man fainted, not from heat exhaustion, but from the second verse. The performance ended with Mussolini beaming, convinced he had rekindled the troops' spirit. In reality, most were wondering if they'd just hallucinated the whole thing. War is cruel, but apparently it could also be surreal. Back in Rome, The combination of wartime stress and unchecked ego pushed his musical mania into dangerous new territory. He began insisting that all state radio broadcasts opened with a short aria, performed by him naturally. The Minister of Communications, who had been hoping to keep enemy bombers from locating transmitters, now had to politely explain that broadcasting Il Duce's voice to the world might not have the intended morale effect. Mussolini, suspicious as ever, accused him of artistic cowardice. It wasn't just the army and ministers who suffered. Civilians soon found themselves drafted into his musical experiments. Factory workers were once interrupted mid-shift when Mussolini made a surprise visit, climbed onto a makeshift platform, and began serenading them with La Donna Immobile. The workers, caught between fatigue and self-preservation, clapped mechanically, their faces betraying the same expression you might have if your boss started juggling knives without warning. But the pièce de résistance, the apex of absurdity, came during the Axis summit in 1941, with Hitler, Goering, and a smattering of Japanese envoys gathered in a grand hall. Mussolini decided that the usual bombast of speeches was too mundane for such a historic moment. Instead, he would open the meeting with a musical declaration of unity. And so, before anyone could flee, he stepped to the center, nodded to an invisible conductor, and began to sing. Eyewitnesses described the scene with a kind of haunted awe. Hitler rigid in his chair, jaw set like he was bracing for artillery. Goering staring at the ceiling as if silently begging the chandeliers to fall. The Japanese delegation frozen, there, polite diplomatic training, the only thing keeping them from bolting. Mussolini sang as if the fate of the world depended on his vibrato, which, tragically, it did not. The performance concluded to a round of applause so cautious it might as well have been a gun salute for an execution. Mussolini took it as a triumph. Music, he declared, binds empires more strongly than treaties. Hitler muttered something about military logistics being more reliable, but Mussolini, already high on the applause, didn't hear him. Even as the war began to turn against him, Mussolini clung to his operatic delusion. Retreats were reframed in his speeches as dramatic pauses. Defeats were minor notes in the symphony of victory. His musical metaphors grew so thick that some listeners wondered if he even realized they were losing. When Rome was bombed, he likened it to the shattering of a great orchestra's instruments, a metaphor the survivors, pulling rubble off their homes, probably found less than comforting. By 1943, with Allied forces advancing and his power slipping, Mussolini's singing had taken on an almost desperate edge. He reportedly staged one last performance for his remaining loyalists in a secluded villa, standing before them with the same grandiosity he'd had in his prime. His voice cracked more than ever, but he sang as if clinging to a past that no longer existed, as if hitting that perfect note might somehow rewind history. It didn't, of course. Not long after, he was deposed, his grandiose illusions collapsing alongside his regime. But the memory of his operatic obsession lingered, whispered about by soldiers, ministers, and civilians alike. For them, Mussolini's voice was not the gift to the nation, he claimed, but the soundtrack to an era of absurdity, proof that sometimes history's tragedies come with their own deranged soundtrack. If you were a soldier on that desert line, would you have joined in to make the moment less awkward, or just stared at your boots until it was over? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how you'd survive a dictator's battlefield recital. After Mussolini's fall, one might think his operatic ambitions would die quietly with his political career, like a bad play that finally closed after too many empty seats. But no, if anything, his voice, preserved in rumor, ridicule, and a few cursed recordings, took on a bizarre afterlife. It became a kind of ghost, haunting post-war Italy with equal parts shame and morbid amusement. The first thing to survive him was, unfortunately, that infamous gramophone record. After the regime collapsed, Allied soldiers combing through abandoned government buildings found stacks of them. Initially, they assumed they were propaganda speeches. Then someone made the mistake of putting one on. Within moments, the room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by a muffled snort from the back. According to legend, a British corporal muttered, "If this is the sound of fascism, no wonder it lost." Some of those records were shipped back to London as novelty items. Others were allegedly used by American GIs as makeshift frisbees in Roman cults and ruins. But the most unexpected aftershock came from Italian radio. In the chaotic post-war months, a rogue technician, perhaps driven by mischief or perhaps seeking revenge for years of forced broadcasts, played one of Mussolini's arias late one night over the airwaves. Listeners across Rome, half asleep, were jolted awake by the unmistakable voice of Il Duce belting O Sole Mio. Some panicked, thinking the dictator had returned. Others just pulled their pillows over their heads and groaned, "Not again." The government issued a formal apology, but the damage was done. The incident became known as La Notte del Fantasma Canoro, the night of the singing ghost. And Mussolini's family? They, too, had to live with the legacy. His son, Romano, an actual jazz musician of some talent, spent years swatting away journalists asking if his father had ever sung at home. Romano's stock answer was a dry, "Yes, but we tried not to encourage him." The fact that Mussolini's musical pretensions became a running joke in cafes, comedy shows, and even schoolyard rhymes was perhaps the final insult to a man who once saw himself as the voice of the nation. Literally, even historians couldn't resist the absurdity. In academic circles, there emerged a fringe theory that Mussolini's obsession with singing was more than just vanity, that it reflected his entire approach to politics. He treated leadership like a performance, governance like a stage, and the people as an audience to be dazzled, whether they wanted the show or not. One scholar put it bluntly, he didn't want to rule Italy, he wanted a standing ovation. But the real strange twist in this saga came years later, in the 1960s, when a small record label in Milan stumbled upon an untouched box of Mussolini's recordings in a warehouse. In a fit of either genius or madness, they released it as a limited-run novelty album titled Il Duce Canta. The leader sings. The cover featured Mussolini in a dramatic pose, mouth open mid-area, eyes blazing. It sold out almost instantly. Not because anyone thought it was good, but because people couldn't resist owning proof that the dictator had once tried to serenade the world. Some played it at parties for laughs, others kept it as a bizarre conversation piece. In the strangest twist of all, a few avant-garde musicians sampled it into experimental tracks, making Mussolini's cracked tenor echo over jazz riffs and psychedelic rock. The irony was inescapable. Mussolini had always wanted his voice to outlive him, to become part of history's great cultural canon. In a way, he got his wish, just not in the form he imagined. Instead of being remembered alongside Caruso, he became a punchline in the great, chaotic cabaret of the 20th century. His opera lived on not as art, but as a cautionary tale about ego, delusion, and the catastrophic consequences of never being told, "Please, for the love of God, stop singing." Even now, in certain corners of Italy, you might hear an old man in a bar hum a few shaky bars of La Donna and Mobile, and smirk. Careful, or Mussolini will come back. His voice has become folklore, the kind that makes you laugh first and wince second. So here's the question for you. If you could pick one modern politician to be cursed with Mussolini's opera obsession, who would it be, and what song would they be forced to sing for the rest of their career? Drop your answers in the comments, and remember, history may not repeat itself exactly, but it definitely knows how to rhyme, and sometimes it rhymes off-key